Carl Jung reveals 11 spiritual truths that prove absorbing every emotion isn't the empath's blessing. There's a truth about empaths that no one in the spiritual community wants to say out loud. A truth so uncomfortable, so threatening to the carefully constructed identity of millions of self-identified empaths, that even mentioning it feels like heresy. But Carl Jung knew it. He saw it in his patients. He warned about it in his writings. And if he were alive today, watching the empath movement sweep through modern spirituality like wildfire, he would recognize it immediately, not as enlightenment, but as one of the most sophisticated psychological defenses the human mind has ever constructed. What I'm about to share with you will not be popular. In fact, some of you will close this video within the next 5 minutes, because what I'm going to say will threaten the very foundation of how you understand yourself. But for those of you who stay, who are brave enough to question the identity you've built your entire life around, what you discover will be more painful and more liberating than anything the spiritual marketplace has ever told you about being an empath. Here it is. What you've been calling your empath gift is actually a sophisticated psychological wound masquerading as spiritual superiority. Let that land for a moment. Feel the resistance rising in your chest. Notice the immediate need to defend, to explain, to prove that your empathic sensitivity is real, is valid, is special. That resistance, that's exactly what we need to examine, because Jung understood something fundamental about human psychology. The more desperately we cling to an identity, the more likely that identity is serving as a defense against something we're not ready to face. Jung wrote, "The psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate." What he meant is this: when we refuse to look at what's actually happening inside our own psyche, we experience it as if it's happening to us from the outside world. And this is precisely the mechanism operating in empathic absorption. You're not absorbing others' emotions as a service to humanity. You're avoiding your own emotions through a defense mechanism that you've dressed up as spiritual sensitivity. Think about it. Really, think about it. When was the last time you sat with your own emotional content without immediately scanning the room for someone else's feelings? When was the last time you allowed yourself to fully feel your own rage, your own grief, your own terror, without deflecting that attention onto how someone else in your life is struggling? If you're honest, and this work requires brutal honesty, you'll realize that your empathic absorption has become the perfect escape route from your own inner world. I discovered this truth the hard way. For years, I identified as an empath. I wore it like a badge of honor. I could walk into a room and immediately sense the emotional temperature. I could tell you what everyone was feeling before they knew themselves. I absorbed my mother's depression, my father's rage, my partner's anxiety. I felt everything, and I told myself this was my gift, that I was here to help others by holding their pain, by processing their emotions, by being the emotional sponge that cleaned up everyone's psychic mess. And then one day, sitting in a therapist's office after what I thought was my third empathic burnout in 2 years, she asked me a question that shattered everything. What are you running from in your own psyche that requires you to stay so focused on everyone else's? I had no answer. I sat there, stunned, because I realized in that moment that I had no idea what I was actually feeling. I had spent so many years absorbed in others that I had completely abandoned myself. And the most disturbing part? That abandonment felt safer than turning inward. Because what I might find in my own psyche terrified me more than anything I could absorb from someone else. This is the forbidden revelation. The empaths who are most proud of their emotional absorption are often the most disconnected from their authentic self, the capital S self that Jung spent his entire life trying to help people discover, that integrated, whole, individuated being Who knows where they end and others begin? The empath identity prevents that discovery. It's designed to prevent it. Because as long as you're absorbed in everyone else's emotional content, you never have to face your own. Now, before you click away in defensive outrage, understand what I'm not saying. I'm not saying you're not sensitive. I'm not saying you don't pick up on emotional information others miss. I'm not saying your experiences of overwhelm aren't real. What I'm saying is that the interpretation you've given those experiences, that you're absorbing others' emotions as a spiritual gift, is a story your psyche constructed to avoid a much more painful truth. Jung would have recognized modern empathic identification as a failure of psychological boundaries, as a merging with the collective unconscious that prevents individuation. He would have seen it as participation mystique, that primitive state of consciousness where the individual hasn't differentiated from the collective, where self and other blur into one undifferentiated mass. And he would have understood that this state, while it might feel special or gifted, is actually a developmental arrest. It's the psyche stuck in childhood, unable to form the boundaries necessary for adult functioning. Throughout this journey together, we're going to dismantle 11 cherished beliefs about empathic gifting and replace them with Jungian psychological truth. Each truth will feel like death because in a way it is. Death of the empath identity that has protected you from yourself. But Jung also taught us there is no birth of consciousness without pain, and what will be born on the other side of this dismantling is something far more valuable than empathic absorption. It's authentic selfhood, it's individuation, it's the capacity for genuine compassion that can only emerge when you stop using others' emotions as a shield against your own. I'm positioning you right now as someone brave enough to question your most sacred identity, because true spiritual evolution doesn't come from reinforcing what makes us feel special. It comes from demolishing false altruism, from tearing down the psychological defenses we've mistaken for spiritual gifts, from having the courage to look at the shadow hiding behind every light we've claimed to carry. Here's what we're going to explore together. We'll trace the origin wound that creates empathic patterns. We'll confront the uncomfortable reality that your absorption is actually avoidance. We'll examine how empathic behavior violates boundaries while claiming to have none. We'll expose the hidden superiority complex lurking in empathic identity. We'll understand why absorption makes individuation impossible. We'll investigate the relationship patterns empaths create and maintain. We'll reframe overwhelm as an undeveloped psychic immune system. We'll confront the addiction to emotional intensity that keeps you trapped. We'll discover why empathic identity prevents authentic service. We'll learn to distinguish collective unconscious flooding from genuine spiritual connection. And finally, we'll walk through the grief of releasing this identity and the liberation of what emerges afterward. This isn't a comfortable journey. If you're looking for validation of your empath identity, close this video now and find one of the thousands of spiritual teachers who will tell you how special and gifted you are. But if you're exhausted, truly exhausted, from the burden of absorbing everyone's emotions, if you suspect somewhere deep down that something about your empathic pattern doesn't quite add up, if you're ready to question whether the identity that's defined you might actually be the cage that confines you, then stay with me, because what you're about to discover will change everything, not just about how you understand empathic sensitivity, but about who you actually are beneath the absorption patterns. Jung called individuation the privilege of a lifetime. But that privilege requires sacrifice, the sacrifice of every false identity, including the ones that feel most precious, most true, most like the very essence of who we are. The empath identity has protected you. It's given you importance when you felt invisible. It's created connection when you felt alone. It's provided an explanation for overwhelming emotions when you had no other framework. And it's allowed you to avoid the most terrifying confrontation of all, the one with your own psyche, with your own shadow, with your own unprocessed emotional content that has nothing to do with anyone else. So here's my promise to you. What you discover in the next 3 hours will hurt. It will challenge everything. You'll want to stop, to defend, to prove me wrong. But if you can stay present with the discomfort, if you can let these truths penetrate your defenses, you'll find something on the other side that no amount of empathic absorption could ever give you. You'll find yourself, your actual self, not the absorbed, merged, boundaryless self that takes on everyone's emotional content, but the individuated, whole, sovereign self that Jung spent his lifetime trying to help people discover. Are you ready? Because once we start pulling this thread, the entire tapestry of empathic identity begins to unravel, and there's no going back. There's only going through the pain, through the grief, through the ego death, through the dark night of identity loss, until you emerge on the other side as someone who no longer needs to hide in others' emotions, because you've finally learned to be present with your own. Let's begin. Before we can dismantle the empath identity, we need to understand how it forms, because nothing in the psyche appears randomly. Every defense mechanism, every behavioral pattern, every identity structure serves a function. And the empathic absorption pattern, it has roots that run deep into childhood soil, into the very formation of self that happens, or fails to happen, in those crucial early years. Let me introduce you to Catherine. She's 43 now, a successful therapist who specializes in trauma work, and until 2 years ago, she wore her empath identity like armor. She could sense a client's emotional state before they sat down. She absorbed their pain, processed their trauma, held their darkness. Her colleagues marveled at her sensitivity. Her clients called her a miracle worker, and Catherine told herself she was born this way, that being an empath was her calling, her gift, the very reason she existed. Then, in her own therapy, working through what she thought was empathic burnout, her therapist asked her to trace back to the first memory of absorbing someone else's emotions. Catherine closed her eyes, went inward, and found herself at age 7, standing in the kitchen of her childhood home, watching her mother stare blankly at the wall while breakfast burned on the stove. "I knew she was gone," Catherine told me later, tears streaming down her face. Not physically gone, but disappeared into her depression. And I remember thinking with perfect clarity, I need to bring her back. I need to figure out what she's feeling and fix it. And from that moment, my entire life became about managing my mother's emotional states. This is where the empathic pattern begins, not in some mystical past life, not as a gift bestowed by the universe, but in a moment of childhood terror, when a developing psyche realizes that survival depends on becoming responsible for a parent's emotions. Jung understood this developmental process deeply. He wrote about the puer eternus and puella eterna, the eternal child who never individuates because they remain merged with the parental psyche. This isn't metaphorical. It's a literal arrest in psychological development, where the child never forms a separate sense of self because forming that separate self feels too dangerous. The parent needed the child to stay merged, to stay attuned, to stay absorbed in their emotional world. And the child, whose survival depends on the parent, complies. The empathic pattern is born. Let's break down the empathic pattern formation step by step, because understanding this mechanism is crucial for everything that follows. Stage 1, childhood emotional parentification. This is where it starts. The child becomes responsible for the parent's emotional regulation. Maybe the parent is depressed, like Catherine's mother. Maybe they're anxious, angry, addicted, narcissistic. The specific emotion doesn't matter. What matters is that the parent cannot regulate their own emotional states, and the child, with a developing nervous system that's designed to attune to caregivers, picks up this responsibility. The child learns to scan for emotional shifts, to predict mood changes, to modify their behavior to prevent emotional explosions. They become, in essence, the parent's therapist. And this role gets encoded into their identity as something essential, something that defines their worth. Stage 2. Boundary dissolution. Here's where the real damage happens. In healthy development, a child forms boundaries through a process called differentiation. They learn where they end and others begin. They develop a sense of, this is me, that is you. But in emotional parentification, boundaries become dangerous. If you maintain boundaries, you can't track your parent's emotional states. If you protect your own psychic space, you can't absorb their overwhelming feelings. If you stay separate, they might collapse, and you might die. So the boundaries that should form, don't. Or they form weakly, full of holes, permeable like a net instead of solid like a wall. And this boundary dissolution feels normal. The child doesn't know anything different. They don't realize that other children are developing psychic immune systems while theirs is being deliberately dismantled. Stage 3. Hypervigilance development. Once boundaries dissolve, hypervigilance rushes in to fill the space. The child's nervous system becomes a scanning device, constantly monitoring the emotional environment for threats. They develop uncanny accuracy in reading micro-expressions, voice tones, body language. They can sense mood shifts before anyone else, and this ability gets praised. You're so sensitive, adults say. You're so intuitive. The child learns that their hypervigilance isn't a stress response. It's a gift. It makes them special. It gives them value. And so they lean into it, developing it, honing it, until scanning for others' emotions becomes as automatic as breathing. Stage 4. Self-abandonment reinforcement. Every time the child prioritizes the parent's emotions over their own, they receive reinforcement. Maybe the parent calms down. Maybe the household tension eases. Maybe they get praise for being such a good child or so mature for your age. These rewards teach the developing psyche a devastating lesson. Your own emotions don't matter. Your needs aren't important. Your value comes from managing others' internal states. Self-abandonment becomes not just acceptable, but virtuous, and the child learns to dissociate from their own emotional content, redirecting attention outward whenever internal feelings arise. This pattern becomes so automatic that by adulthood, the person has no idea they're even doing it. Stage 5. Identity construction. Finally, the empathic pattern solidifies into identity. It stops being something the person does and becomes who they are. I'm an empath replaces I absorbed my parents' emotions as a survival mechanism. The behavioral pattern becomes personality. The defense mechanism becomes destiny. And this identity brings with it a whole psychological structure, community, belonging, explanation for suffering, framework for understanding overwhelm, justification for dysfunction. The empathic identity wraps around the person like a cocoon, protecting them from having to confront the original wound while simultaneously preventing them from ever healing it. Now, here's what Jung would want us to understand about this formation process. It's brilliant. The psyche is protecting itself in the most intelligent way possible given the circumstances. A child who cannot leave, who depends on their caregiver for survival, who finds themselves in an environment where boundaries are violated and emotional responsibility is reversed, that child must adapt. An empathic absorption is an adaptation. It's not pathology in the moment of its creation, it's genius. It's the psyche saying, I cannot change my environment, so I must change myself to survive it. But, and this is the crucial distinction Jung made throughout his work, what serves us in childhood becomes our prison in adulthood. The adaptation that saved us then confines us now, and the identity that formed around that adaptation prevents us from ever questioning whether we still need those defenses. Jung wrote, "The most intense conflicts, if overcome, leave behind a sense of security and calm that is not easily disturbed. It is just these intense conflicts and their conflagration which are needed to produce valuable and lasting results." He understood that transformation requires confronting the original conflict, in this case, the childhood situation that demanded empathic absorption. But confronting that conflict means acknowledging that what you've called your gift was actually a wound, and that acknowledgement feels like betrayal. When Catherine finally understood the origin of her empathic pattern, she went through profound grief. She grieved for the 7-year-old who should have been playing with toys, but was instead managing her mother's depression. She grieved for the adolescent who couldn't develop her own identity because she was too busy absorbing her father's rage. She grieved for the young adult who chose relationships with emotionally unavailable partners because they replicated the original wound. And she grieved for the decades spent believing her absorption was her purpose when it was actually her prison. But through that grief came something unexpected. Rage. Pure, clean rage at the violation of her childhood, at the burden placed on her developing psyche, at the years lost to a pattern she didn't choose. And that rage, which she'd been avoiding through empathic absorption her entire life, became the fuel for her liberation. This is what we need to understand about the origin wound. It's not about blaming parents. Most parents who create these dynamics are simply repeating patterns from their own childhoods. It's about understanding the mechanism so we can dismantle it consciously instead of living it unconsciously. Let me share my own origin wound because I promised vulnerability in this journey. My empathic pattern formed around my father's alcoholism. Every evening I would track his drinking, monitor his mood shifts, predict when he might explode. My nervous system became a finely tuned instrument, calibrated to one single frequency, his emotional state. And I told myself I was being responsible, being mature, being helpful. The truth? I was terrified. And that terror got repackaged as sensitivity, as intuition, as empathic gifting. By the time I was in my 20s, I couldn't walk into a room without immediately scanning for threats, without absorbing everyone's emotional states, without taking responsibility for managing the collective mood. And I called this being an empath. I joined online communities. I read books about empathic protection. I learned energy clearing techniques. I did everything except confront the original wound, that I was a child who needed protection but learned to be the protector instead. Here's the distinction Jung wants us to grasp. Authentic empathy requires a strong sense of self to temporarily extend toward another, then return. It's like a healthy immune system that can encounter a pathogen, respond appropriately, then return to baseline. But empathic absorption is a dissolved self chronically leaked into others. It's like an immune system with no boundaries where every pathogen floods the entire system because there's no protective barrier. Genuine compassion flows from someone who knows where they end and others begin. They can be with your pain without becoming your pain. They can hold space for your emotions without absorbing them. They can extend empathy consciously, deliberately, and then return to their own center. This requires individuation, the process Jung spent his life teaching, where you become a separate, integrated, whole individual. But empathic absorption is the opposite of individuation. It's remaining merged with others, chronically extended into their psychic space, unable to return to your own center because you never developed one. And this pattern, formed in childhood to ensure survival, becomes in adulthood the very thing preventing you from thriving. The mirror effect here is crucial. The people you judge for being emotionally unavailable, the ones who don't cry easily, who don't absorb others' feelings, who maintain clear boundaries, they possess the psychological development you never received. They're not cold or disconnected. They're differentiated. They developed the psychic structure that empathic parentification prevented you from forming. And your judgment of them is actually envy masquerading as superiority. So before we can move forward in dismantling the empathic identity, we must honor its origin. We must acknowledge that this pattern formed for a reason. It protected you when you needed protection. It gave you a role when you needed purpose. It made sense of chaos when you needed understanding. The empathic identity served you once. But here's what Jung understood about psychological development. What got you here won't get you there. The mechanisms that ensured childhood survival become the obstacles to adult thriving. And the courage required for this work is the courage to acknowledge that your greatest strength might be your greatest limitation, that your most cherished identity might be your primary cage, that what you've been calling a gift might actually be a wound requiring healing. Catherine told me something profound after she began healing her empathic pattern. She said, "The hardest part wasn't acknowledging the wound. The hardest part was accepting that I'm not special because of it. My empathic absorption doesn't make me more evolved or more spiritual. It just makes me wounded in a specific way. And that truth, that I'm just a person with unhealed trauma, not a gifted empath, that was the death I had to die before I could begin to live. That death is what we're preparing for. The death of the empathic identity. The death of specialness through suffering. The death of importance through absorption. Not because these things are evil, but because they're keeping you from the one thing Jung believed was essential for human wholeness, becoming who you actually are instead of remaining merged with everyone else. Are you ready to continue? Because now that we understand how the pattern forms, we can begin to dismantle it. Truth by truth, belief by belief, defense by defense, until the authentic self, the one that's been buried under layers of absorption, finally has space to emerge. Let me tell you about David, 41 years old, meditation teacher, healer, self-identified empath, who had built his entire professional life around his gift of absorption. He could walk into a yoga studio and immediately sense everyone's emotional state. He absorbed his clients' pain during healing sessions. He took on his partner's anxiety, his mother's grief, his friends' struggles, and he wore this ability like a medal of honor. Then one afternoon, sitting in his car after what should have been a routine healing session, something cracked. He'd absorbed so much from his client, depression, hopelessness, suicidal ideation, that he couldn't drive home. He sat there for 2 hours, paralyzed by what he believed was his client's despair. And in that paralysis, a thought emerged from somewhere deep. What if this isn't hers? What if this is mine? That thought terrified him more than anything he'd ever absorbed from anyone else. Here's the first truth, and it's going to detonate the foundation of empathic identity. Every moment spent absorbed in someone else's emotional state is a moment of sophisticated dissociation from your own psyche. Let that penetrate. You're not absorbing others' emotions as some kind of psychic service. You're redirecting attention away from your own emotional content, because facing it feels more dangerous than absorbing anything from anyone else. The empathic absorption is a magic trick. Misdirection so skillful that even you believe you're feeling someone else's feelings when you're actually fleeing your own. Jung called this projection and participation mystique. In projection, we unconsciously expel psychic content that threatens consciousness and perceive it as existing in others. In participation mystique, we remain in a primitive state of identification where self and other blur because individuation hasn't occurred, and empathic absorption combines both. You project your own emotional content onto others, then merge with them to feel what you've actually placed there yourself. The mechanism works like this. You have emotional content arising in your own psyche, let's say rage. But that rage threatens your self-concept. Maybe you've built an identity around being peaceful, spiritual, enlightened. Maybe expressing rage got you punished or abandoned in childhood. Maybe rage feels dangerous, overwhelming, unacceptable. So your psyche, in its brilliant defensive wisdom, redirects attention outward. Suddenly you're overwhelmed by someone else's anger. Your partner seems furious. Your mother appears hostile. Your coworker radiates aggression, and you absorb it, process it, manage it, feel devastated by it. You're drowning in anger that you believe belongs to them. Meanwhile, your own rage remains safely unconscious, unfelt, unacknowledged. The dissociation is complete. You've successfully avoided your own emotional content by believing you're absorbing someone else's. David discovered this pattern through an exercise his therapist gave him. Every time he felt overwhelmed by absorbed emotions, he had to stop and ask, if this feeling were actually mine, what would it be about? The first time he asked that question during what he thought was absorbing his partner's anxiety, the answer hit him like lightning. I'm terrified I've wasted my entire life on spiritual bypassing instead of doing real psychological work. The anxiety he'd been absorbing from his partner for years. It was his own existential terror that his whole identity as a healer was just an elaborate defense against facing himself. And once he saw this, he couldn't unsee it. Every absorbed emotion became suspect. Every empathic episode became an opportunity to ask, what am I avoiding in my own psyche? Let's break down the avoidance through absorption pattern because understanding this mechanism is crucial. Step 1. Threatening emotion arises in your unconscious. Something triggers your own emotional content, rage, grief, terror, shame, desire. But this content threatens your ego structure, your self-concept, your carefully maintained identity. Your psyche recognizes the threat before it reaches consciousness. Step 2. Psyche redirects attention to external target. Instead of allowing the emotion into consciousness, where you'd have to feel it, process it, integrate it, your psyche performs a brilliant maneuver. It redirects your attention outward, finding someone in your environment who might plausibly be experiencing a similar emotion. Step 3. You feel their emotion. Now you're overwhelmed by what you believe is their emotional content. You're absorbing their rage, their grief, their terror. Your empathic identity activates. You tell yourself you're being of service, that you're processing their pain, that this is your gift. Meanwhile, your own emotional content remains safely unconscious. Step 4. Focus remains external. You spend hours, days, weeks focused on their emotional state. You try to help them, heal them, fix them. You discuss their feelings with others. You research ways to support them. All of this external focus ensures you never turn inward to confront your own psyche. Step 5. Identity as absorber solidifies. The more you repeat this pattern, the more it becomes identity. I'm an empath replaces I'm avoiding my own emotions. The defense mechanism becomes personality, and now you have a whole community, a whole framework, a whole belief system reinforcing the avoidance as if it were a gift. Jung wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." This is the key to unlocking empathic absorption. Everything you believe you're absorbing from others is actually information about your own psyche. The rage you sense in your father, your own rage. The depression you absorb from your friend, your own depression. The anxiety you take on from your partner, your own anxiety. This doesn't mean others don't have their own emotional content. Of course they do. But what you're experiencing isn't their emotion, it's yours. You're just projecting it onto them, then merging with the projection, then claiming you absorbed it. It's a perfect closed loop that prevents self-knowledge while creating the illusion of supreme sensitivity. Now here's where this gets uncomfortable. Empaths are often the least self-aware people because their attention is chronically externalized. Ask an empath what they're feeling, and they'll tell you what everyone around them is feeling. Ask them to stay with their own emotional content for 5 minutes and watch them unconsciously redirect to someone else's state. The empathic identity has become so complete that there's no self left to know. I'll share my own brutal awakening to this pattern. For years, I absorbed my mother's depression. I could sense it the moment I walked in her house. It would overwhelm me, drag me down, make it impossible to function. I developed elaborate clearing rituals to release what I had absorbed. I joined support groups for empaths dealing with depressed family members. I told myself I was being noble, carrying this burden for her. Then, in therapy, my therapist asked a simple question. What do you feel under the absorbed depression? And I said, reflexively, I don't feel anything. The depression is too overwhelming. She pressed, what if the depression is yours? What would it be about? I was offended. My mother was the depressed one, not me. I had my life together. I was functional, successful, productive. And she waited, letting the question sit, until something in me cracked and I heard myself say, I'm profoundly depressed about having sacrificed my entire life to managing her emotions instead of living my own. In that moment, I realized I'd been projecting my depression onto her for decades, then absorbing it back, then calling it empathic sensitivity. The depression was mine. It had always been mine. But feeling my own depression meant confronting the devastating reality of decades lost to this pattern. It was easier to believe I was absorbing hers. This is what Jung meant when he said, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The darkness isn't out there in others' emotions. The darkness is in your own psyche, in the feelings you've spent a lifetime avoiding by focusing on everyone else's. Let me introduce you to the self-emotion audit, a framework for distinguishing genuine empathy from avoidant absorption. Question 1. If this emotion were actually mine, what would it reveal about me that I don't want to know? This question cuts through all the spiritual bypass. If the rage you're absorbing is actually yours, what would it tell you? That you're angry about sacrificing yourself, that you resent people you claim to love, that you're furious about the life you didn't live. Whatever the answer, that's what you're avoiding. Question 2. What identity or self-concept would collapse if I acknowledged this emotion as mine? Maybe you've built an identity around being peaceful, and acknowledging rage would destroy that. Maybe you're the strong one, and acknowledging terror would crack that facade. The identity that would collapse is the one the empathic absorption is protecting. Question 3. What behavior patterns do I maintain through believing this emotion belongs to someone else? Maybe absorbing your partner's anxiety allows you to avoid addressing your own patterns. Maybe absorbing your child's emotions justifies hovering instead of allowing autonomy. Maybe absorbing your friend's pain maintains a relationship where you're the helper and they're the helped, preventing equal connection. Question 4. What would change in my life if I stopped absorbing and started feeling? This is where the real resistance lives, because if you stopped absorbing others' emotions and started feeling your own, you might have to make changes. Leave relationships, set boundaries, confront people, change careers, and the empathic absorption has been preventing all of that change. David worked through this audit with every emotion he believed he was absorbing. the client's suicidal ideation that paralyzed him in his car. When he asked if it were his, he discovered his own desperate desire to die to his false identity as a healer, the rage he absorbed from his partner, his own fury at having built a life around spiritual performance instead of authentic development, the grief he absorbed from his mother, his own mourning for the childhood he lost to empathic parentification. Every absorbed emotion, when traced back through these questions, revealed his own psychic content. And this revelation devastated him because it meant his entire identity as an empath, his career, his relationships, his sense of purpose, all of it had been constructed on a foundation of avoidance. Here's the mirror effect for this truth. When you judge others for being self-centered or focused on themselves, you're sensing the self-focus you desperately need. The people you criticize for not being empathic enough, for not absorbing others' emotions, for maintaining boundaries, they're not deficient. They're differentiated. They possess the capacity for self-awareness that your empathic absorption prevents. I need to warn you, this truth will feel like death because it is. It's the death of the empathic identity that's protected you from your own psyche. When you start recognizing that every absorbed emotion is actually yours, the ground beneath your entire sense of self begins to crumble. You can't be the special empath gifted with absorption if absorption is just avoidance. You can't be the noble helper processing others' pain if you're actually fleeing your own. But here's the liberation Jung promised. Your emotions belong to you. Every feeling you've spent a lifetime believing you absorbed from others, that rage, that grief, that terror, that shame, it's yours. It's been yours all along. And reclaiming it is the path to wholeness. When you stop absorbing others' emotions and start feeling your own, something remarkable happens. The overwhelm decreases because you're no longer carrying your own emotional content, plus the projected belief that you're carrying others. You're just carrying yours. And your own emotions, when you actually feel them instead of projecting them, are manageable. They're yours. They belong to you. They have messages for you. That rage you've been absorbing from your father, when you claim it as yours, you discover its anger about boundaries violated, needs unmet, selfhood sacrificed. That grief you've been absorbing from your friend, when you own it, you find its mourning for parts of yourself abandoned in the service of caretaking. That anxiety you've been absorbing from your partner, when you acknowledge it, you realize it's fear about facing your authentic desires instead of managing others' needs. David told me something profound 6 months into his own emotion reclamation work. He said, "I used to think being an empath made me special. Now I understand it made me unavailable to myself, to genuine connection, to actual life. Real empathy isn't absorption. Real empathy is being so individuated, so present with your own emotional content, that you can be with someone else's without merging, without fleeing, without making it about you." That's where we're headed. Not to the death of sensitivity, but to its maturation. Not to becoming cold or disconnected, but to becoming differentiated enough that your empathy serves instead of destroys. But getting there requires facing this first truth. You're not absorbing energy from others. You're avoiding your own. And every moment you spend focused on someone else's emotional state is a moment stolen from your own development, your own individuation, your own life. So here's the question that begins the liberation. What have you been avoiding in your own psyche that's so threatening it requires constant focus on everyone else's? Because whatever it is, that rage, that grief, that terror, that shame, that desire, it's waiting for you. It's been waiting your whole life. And it's time to stop running. Your emotions are yours. They've always been yours. And claiming them is not the end of your empathy. It's the beginning of your wholeness. There's a shadow side to empathic behavior that no one in the spiritual community wants to acknowledge. A violation so subtle, so wrapped in the language of caring and sensitivity, that even naming it feels like blasphemy. But Carl Jung understood something fundamental about the human psyche. Every light casts a shadow, and the brighter we claim our light, the darker the shadow we're refusing to see. Let me introduce you to Rachel, 38 years old, life coach, empath, proud of her ability to feel everything about her clients, her friends, her family. She could sense what people needed before they asked. She knew when someone was lying, hiding something in pain. She prided herself on this intuitive knowing, called it her greatest gift, built her entire professional identity around it. Then one day, in a supervision session with her own therapist, she described a recent interaction with a client. "I could feel she wasn't telling me the whole truth," Rachel said. "So I called her out on it. I told her I sensed she was hiding something about her marriage, and she broke down and admitted she was having an affair." Rachel expected praise for her intuitive accuracy. Instead, her therapist asked a question that stopped her cold. Did she give you permission to enter her psychic space that way? Did she consent to you reading her internal state and confronting her with your interpretation? Rachel was confused. "But I'm an empath. That's what I do. I sense what people are feeling. I help them by naming what they can't name themselves." Her therapist leaned forward. "Rachel, what you're describing is a boundary violation. You're entering someone's private internal world without permission, extracting information they haven't chosen to share, and then using that information to confront them. The fact that you're accurate doesn't make it not a violation. It makes it a more effective violation." Rachel left that session shaken, because if her therapist was right, then everything she'd been calling her empathic gift, the sensing, the knowing, the intuitive reading of others, was actually a pattern of chronic boundary violation she'd been committing her entire life while calling it service. This is the second truth, and it's going to confront the shadow side of empathic identity that remains conveniently unconscious. Empathic absorption is unconscious boundary violation masquerading as sensitivity. Jung spent his career studying psychological boundaries, not just the obvious ones we think of as personal space, but the deeper psychic boundaries that define where one person's consciousness ends and another's begins. He understood that healthy psychological development requires clear differentiation, knowing what's yours and what's others, maintaining sovereignty over your own psychic space while respecting others' sovereignty over theirs. But empathic absorption violates this fundamental principle. It involves chronically entering others' psychic space without permission, extracting emotional information, processing it, and often acting on it, all while claiming this violation is actually a gift, a service, a form of deep caring. Here's what makes this so difficult to see. Empaths simultaneously claim to have no boundaries themselves while constantly breaching others' boundaries. They say things like, "I'm so open, I feel everything," presenting boundarylessness as virtue. But that openness isn't reciprocal respect for others' psychic autonomy. It's actually a demand that others remain open to empathic intrusion, while the empath floods them with absorption, projection, and unsolicited emotional caretaking. Let's break down the violation dynamic, because understanding this pattern requires seeing it clearly. The empath breaches others' boundaries. This happens constantly, often unconsciously. The empath senses what someone is feeling without that person choosing to share it. They know someone is hiding something. They feel what's really going on beneath the surface, and they believe this knowing is intuition, gifting, sensitivity. But from a Jungian perspective, it's actually psychic intrusion, entering someone's private internal world without consent, while claiming to have none themselves. Simultaneously, the empath presents as having no boundaries, being completely open, absorbing everything. This creates a strange double bind. I have no boundaries, so I'm vulnerable and need protection. But also I can enter your psychic space at will because my absorption is a gift. The lack of boundaries becomes both shield, I'm too sensitive to be challenged, and sword, I can read you without permission, creating a system where they're simultaneously invaded and invading. The empath feels invaded by others' emotions, which we now understand are often their own projected content, while simultaneously invading others through psychic intrusion. Neither boundary violation gets acknowledged because the whole system is framed as sensitivity rather than dysfunction. Jung wrote about individuation requiring clear differentiation, knowing where you end and others begin. This isn't about building walls or becoming cold. It's about respecting the fundamental reality that each person is a separate consciousness with the right to privacy in their own psyche. You don't have automatic access to others' internal states just because you can sense them, and others' emotional content isn't yours to process just because you can feel it. Rachel began tracking her boundary violations. Once she could see the pattern, she realized she knew what others felt without asking. Instead of inquiring, "How are you feeling?" she would declare, "I can feel that you're angry," forcing the other person to either confirm her intuition, reinforcing her identity as accurate empath, or deny it, allowing her to claim they're not in touch with their feelings. Made assumptions about internal states. She interpreted others' emotions through her own psychic content, then presented those interpretations as if they were objective truth. "I sense you're sabotaging this relationship because you're afraid of intimacy," she'd tell a client, without considering that her interpretation might be projection. Took on emotional responsibility that wasn't offered. When someone in her life was struggling, she immediately absorbed their emotional state and began processing it, never stopping to ask if they wanted her to do that. Her absorption happened without consent. Then she'd feel resentful that she was carrying others' burdens, engaged in energetic enmeshment without permission. She merged with others' psychic space, letting her consciousness bleed into theirs, assuming this merging was welcome because it felt like connection to her. The possibility that others might experience it as intrusion never occurred to her. Used emotional absorption to control relationships. This was the hardest one for Rachel to see. But when she got honest, she realized her empathic absorption gave her power in relationships. She could control the emotional temperature. She could claim to know what others were really feeling. She could position herself as the one with deeper insight. The absorption wasn't just service. It was a form of subtle domination. Jung warned, "Where love rules, there is no will to power, and where power predominates, love is lacking." This is the shadow of empathic absorption. It's often a power move disguised as caring. The empath gets to be the one who knows, who senses, who understands what others can't see about themselves. And that knowing creates a hierarchy where the empath is superior, more aware, more in touch with emotional reality. I need to share my own violation pattern because confronting this truth requires brutal honesty. For years, I prided myself on knowing what my partner was feeling before she did. I'd tell her, "You're not really angry about the dishes, you're upset about what happened with your mother today." And I'd be right. My accuracy felt like proof of my empathic gifting. Then one day, after I'd interrupted her attempting to express something, to tell her what she was really feeling, she exploded. "Stop telling me what I feel. Stop invading my internal world and then acting like you're helping me. I need to discover my own emotions at my own pace, not have you extract them and force me to look at them before I'm ready." I was devastated. I thought I was being supportive, intuitive, helpful. She told me I was being invasive, controlling, violating, and she was right. I'd been breaching her boundaries for years, entering her psychic space without permission, extracting emotional information, and then using it to maintain a position of the one who knows in our relationship. The violation wasn't that I could sense her emotions. The violation was that I claimed ownership over them, processed them without her consent, and used my accuracy to establish psychological dominance. My empathic absorption wasn't love, it was covert control. Here are the specific violations empaths commit while calling it sensitivity. Violation 1. Reading internal states without consent. Just because you can sense something doesn't mean you have the right to. Other people's internal experiences belong to them. Sensing someone's fear, rage, or shame without them choosing to share it is like reading their diary without permission. Your accuracy doesn't justify the intrusion. Violation 2. Confronting others with unsolicited interpretations. When you tell someone, "I feel your resistance," or "I sense you're in denial," or "I know you're hiding something," you're forcing them to respond to your interpretation of their internal state. This puts them in an impossible position. Agree and reinforce your empathic identity, or disagree and be labeled as unaware. Violation 3. Processing others' emotions without permission. When you absorb someone's emotional content and begin processing it, crying about their pain, raging about their situation, obsessing about their problems, you're taking their psychic material and making it yours. This is violation even when done with good intentions. Their emotions are theirs to process, not yours to extract and work through. Violation 4. Energetic enmeshment. When you merge your consciousness with someone else's, letting the boundaries between you dissolve, you're violating both your psychic integrity and theirs. Two separate consciousnesses exist for a reason. Merging feels like intimacy, but it's actually the absence of two individuated beings who could meet in genuine relationship. Violation 5. Using absorption to manipulate. This is the shadow most empaths refuse to see. When you absorb someone's emotions, you gain information and leverage. You can use that to influence their decisions, control the relationship dynamic, position yourself as indispensable, or maintain emotional power. The absorption becomes a tool for covert manipulation disguised as sensitivity. Jung understood that genuine compassion requires respecting others' autonomy. You can offer presence, support, listening, but you can't invade their psychic space and claim it's caring. You can develop your own boundaries and invite them to share if they choose, but you can't extract their emotional content and process it without consent. Rachel had to completely restructure her relationships once she saw this pattern. She had to learn to ask instead of assume. "Are you open to me sharing what I'm sensing?" became her new protocol. And when people said no, she had to respect that, even when her empathic urge to help was overwhelming. She discovered something shocking. Most people didn't want her empathic absorption. They wanted her presence, her listening, her respect for their process. But they didn't want her entering their psychic space, extracting their emotions, and processing them. That kind of help felt invasive, not supportive. One friend told her, "When you absorb my emotions and start processing them, I feel like you're stealing something from me, like you're not letting me have my own experience. I need to sit with my feelings at my own pace, feel them in my own way, come to my own insights. When you bypass all that with your absorption, you're actually preventing my growth." This feedback devastated Rachel because it meant everything she thought was helping was actually hindering. Her empathic absorption, which she'd believed was her greatest gift, was preventing the people she loved from developing their own emotional sovereignty. Here's the mirror effect for this truth. The people you judge for having walls up, for being guarded, for maintaining rigid boundaries, They're not pathological. They're practicing healthy psychic boundaries. They're protecting their internal world from intrusion. They've developed the boundary strength that empathic parentification prevented you from forming. And your judgment of their boundaries is actually envy disguised as spiritual superiority. The person who won't let you in, who maintains privacy, who doesn't share everything, who keeps their internal experience to themselves until they choose to reveal it. That's not someone who's emotionally unavailable. That's someone who respects the sovereignty of their own psyche and expects you to respect it too. They're not the problem, the violation is. I had to grieve when I understood this. I had to grieve the relationships I'd damaged through empathic violation. I had to grieve the identity as the one who knows that I'd built on boundary breaches. I had to grieve the false intimacy I'd created through merging instead of meeting as two separate beings. And most painfully, I had to grieve the recognition that what I'd been calling love was often control, that my sensitivity was often intrusion, that my gifting was often violation. But through that grief came liberation, because once you stop violating boundaries, others and your own, you can begin to build genuine relationship. You can meet someone as a separate consciousness, respect their internal world, allow them their process, and offer presence without intrusion. This is what Jung meant by the conjunctio, the sacred union of two individuated beings, but it requires two separate beings. Violation and merging aren't intimacy. They're fusion that prevents real contact. Let me be explicit about what changes when you stop violating boundaries through empathic absorption. You ask instead of assume. Would you like to share what you're feeling? Replaces, I can feel that you're angry. You give others agency over their emotional revelations instead of extracting them. You respect no. When someone doesn't want to share, doesn't want your empathic reading, doesn't want you processing their emotions, you respect that. Even when your empathic urge is screaming, their no matters more than your need to help. You maintain your center. You can be present with someone's pain without absorbing it, merging with it, making it yours. You develop the capacity to witness without violating, to support without enmeshing, to care without controlling. You honor privacy. You recognize that other people's internal worlds are sovereign territory. Just because you can sense something doesn't give you access rights. Their psyche is theirs. Your role is to respect that, not invade it. You release the power position. You let go of being the one who knows, the empathic authority who can read everyone's emotions. You accept that you might sense things, but your sensing doesn't give you superior insight or the right to confront others with your interpretations. Rachel told me something profound after a year of this work. I thought developing boundaries would make me less sensitive, less connected, less helpful. Instead, I discovered that people actually let me closer because I'm no longer violating them. They share more because I'm asking instead of extracting. They trust me more because I respect their internal sovereignty. Real intimacy requires boundaries. The merging I called intimacy was just mutual violation. This is what Jung understood about individuation and relationship. Genuine connection requires two separate selves. When empaths stop violating boundaries and start respecting them, they become capable of authentic relationship for the first time. Not merging, not absorbing, not enmeshing, but meeting. Two individuated consciousnesses making genuine contact while maintaining sovereignty. I need to warn you, recognizing your empathic absorption as boundary violation will shatter your self-concept. You've probably built an identity around being sensitive, intuitive, helpful. Seeing that sensitivity as violation, that intuition as intrusion, that helping as control, it's going to hurt. You'll want to defend, rationalize, prove that your absorption is different, special, welcome. but I invite you to sit with the discomfort. Ask the people in your life how they experience your empathic absorption, not whether you're accurate. Accuracy isn't the question. Ask whether they feel respected, whether they feel their internal sovereignty is honored, whether your sensing feels like support or invasion. Be prepared for answers that challenge everything you believe about your gift. The liberation on the other side is worth the discomfort, because when you stop violating boundaries and start respecting them, you discover what Jung knew. True empathy isn't absorption. True empathy is being so individuated, so boundaried, so clear about where you end and others begin, that you can extend genuine, compassionate presence without merging, without violating, without controlling. Your empathic sensitivity doesn't have to be violation, but it will remain violation until you develop the boundaries that make it respectful, consensual, and honoring of others' psychic autonomy. The question is, are you ready to release the power that comes from empathic intrusion? Are you ready to respect others' boundaries even when your empathic urge is overwhelming? Are you ready to discover what authentic connection looks like when it's built on respect instead of violation? Because that's what's waiting on the other side of this truth. Not the loss of sensitivity, but its maturation into something that actually serves instead of violates. Not the end of empathy, but its transformation into genuine, compassionate presence that honors the sovereignty of every consciousness it encounters. I'm going to tell you something that will make empaths furious, and that fury will prove the point. Empaths often carry a hidden belief that they're more evolved, more sensitive, more spiritually advanced than normal people. And this superiority complex is the shadow they refuse to integrate. Meet Michael, 45 years old, spiritual teacher, proud empath who had built his entire brand around being too sensitive for this world. He wore his empathic suffering like a crown. He spoke about the burden of awareness and the curse of feeling everything with a kind of tragic nobility. He positioned himself as one of the rare souls evolved enough to perceive what others couldn't, feel what others didn't, understand what remained hidden to less developed consciousness. Then one day, in a group therapy session, another participant called him out. They said, "Michael, every time you talk about your empathic sensitivity, I hear you saying you're better than everyone else, more aware, more evolved, suffering in ways we can't understand because we're not as sensitive as you. Your humility is performance. Underneath, you believe you're superior." Michael was outraged. How dare they accuse him of superiority when he was describing his wound, his burden, his curse? But the group facilitator asked a question that pierced his defense. "Michael, if you discovered tomorrow that you weren't actually more sensitive than others, that your empathic overwhelm was just unhealed trauma, creating hypervigilance, would you feel relieved? Or would you feel less special?" The silence that followed answered the question. Michael would feel less special because his empathic identity wasn't just about the suffering. It was about what that suffering meant, that he was different, gifted, evolved, aware in ways others weren't. His empathic burden was also his empathic superiority, and confronting that superiority meant facing the shadow he'd been hiding behind his claims of victimhood. This is the third truth, and it's going to expose the spiritual ego lurking beneath empathic identity. The empath identity creates a sophisticated shadow structure where you simultaneously claim victimhood through overwhelm while positioning yourself as spiritually superior to those who don't feel as deeply. Jung spent decades helping people integrate their shadow, those aspects of personality that consciousness rejects, that get pushed into the unconscious, that we refuse to acknowledge as part of ourselves. And he understood something crucial. The brighter the persona we present to the world, the darker the shadow we're concealing. The more we claim to be good, pure, evolved, the more we're compensating for shadow qualities we can't integrate. The empath identity creates a perfect shadow structure because it allows you to feel superior while claiming to suffer. You're not overtly claiming you're better than others. That would be too obvious, too ego-inflated. Instead, you're claiming you're more sensitive, more aware, more burdened with perception. And underneath that claim is a belief system most empaths never examine. I feel more deeply. I perceive more accurately. I'm cursed with awareness others don't possess. I suffer because I'm evolved beyond normal human capacity for emotional management. Let's break down the empath shadow components because seeing this structure requires looking at what we most want to deny. Component 1, hidden superiority. I feel more deeply. This is the foundation of the shadow structure. Empaths believe they experience emotions more intensely, more authentically, more fully than others. When someone doesn't cry easily, doesn't absorb others' feelings, doesn't get overwhelmed in crowds, the empath judges them as emotionally stunted, disconnected, shut down. The judgment creates hierarchy. My emotional intensity proves my evolution. Your emotional regulation proves your limitation. Component 2, covert judgment. They're emotionally primitive. Empaths constantly judge others for being less sensitive. The person who maintains boundaries, cold. The person who doesn't absorb emotions, disconnected. The person who prioritizes their own needs, selfish. The person who can function in crowds, unaware. Every judgment reinforces the hidden belief. I'm more evolved because I'm more sensitive. Component 3, martyr complex. I suffer for others. The empath positions their overwhelm as noble suffering, as carrying burdens others can't or won't bear. I feel everyone's pain so deeply becomes not just description but identity claim, and that claim carries hidden superiority. My suffering proves my value. My sensitivity proves my spiritual advancement. My overwhelm proves I care more than you. Component 4, spiritual materialism. My sensitivity proves my evolution. Empaths collect their sensitivity like spiritual credentials. They join empath groups, read empath books, share empath memes, create empath identities on social media. The sensitivity becomes spiritual status, proof they're more advanced on the consciousness spectrum than normal people who don't have the gift. Component 5, victim identity. I'm cursed by awareness. While claiming superiority, empaths simultaneously claim victimhood. They're too sensitive for this harsh world. They're overwhelmed by perceptions others don't have. They're suffering from a gift they didn't ask for. This victim identity protects against seeing the superiority because how can I think I'm better than others when I'm describing my curse? Component 6, subtle narcissism. My internal experience is most important. Despite claiming to focus on others, empaths make everything about their own internal experience. I feel so overwhelmed by your energy centers their experience rather than yours. I can't be around you because I absorb your emotions, makes their sensitivity more important than relationship. The chronic self-focus gets hidden behind claims of other focus. Jung wrote, everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. The empath shadow is dense precisely because it's so well hidden behind the persona of sensitivity. You can't integrate what you can't see, and empaths have constructed an elaborate belief system that prevents them from seeing their own superiority complex. Michael spent 6 months working specifically on his empath shadow. He had to get brutally honest about what his empathic identity actually gave him. It made him special. In a world where he often felt invisible, inadequate, ordinary, being an empath made him unique, gifted, different in ways that mattered. It justified his judgments. He could judge others for being emotionally unavailable, shut down, primitive, and frame that judgment as accurate perception rather than shadow projection. It positioned him as more evolved. He could believe he was further along the spiritual path than others because his sensitivity proved his development. It created importance through suffering. His empathic overwhelm made him significant. People worried about him, adjusted their behavior for him, treated him as fragile and special. It allowed covert superiority. He could feel better than others while claiming to be wounded. The superiority stayed hidden behind the suffering. It prevented genuine equality in relationships. He was always the sensitive one, the empath, the one who felt more deeply. This created hierarchy that prevented peer connection. Seeing these shadow motivations devastated Michael because they revealed that his empathic identity wasn't just about sensitivity. It was about ego, about specialness, about hidden narcissism dressed in the language of spiritual gifting, and confronting that shadow meant acknowledging that he wasn't actually more evolved than others. He was just wounded in a specific way that he'd learned to frame as advancement. I need to share my own empathic shadow because integration requires confession. For years, I secretly believed I was more emotionally evolved than most people. I looked at people who maintained boundaries and thought, they're shut down. I looked at people who didn't absorb emotions and thought, they lack depth. I looked at people who prioritized themselves and thought, they're selfish. Every judgment reinforced my hidden belief that my empathic sensitivity proved my spiritual superiority. Then someone I respected called me out. They said, you talk about empathy, but I don't feel empathy from you. I feel judgment. I feel you analyzing me, categorizing me, deciding whether I'm emotionally evolved enough to be worth your time. Your empathy is performance. Underneath, you believe you're better than most people because you're more sensitive. I was devastated and furious. How dare they accuse me of superiority when I spent my life absorbing others' pain? But when I got honest, really brutally honest, I had to acknowledge they were right. My empathic identity was constructed on a foundation of hidden superiority. I believed I felt more deeply, perceived more accurately, understood emotional reality better than less sensitive people. And that belief was shadow, rejected parts of myself projected onto others as inferiority. Here's the shadow integration process for empaths, because confronting this requires specific steps. Step 1. Acknowledge the superiority. Stop pretending your empathic identity is just about sensitivity. Acknowledge that you believe your sensitivity makes you more evolved. Acknowledge that you judge others for being less sensitive. Acknowledge that you feel special, different, more advanced because of your empathic capacity. This acknowledgement is brutal because it shatters the humble persona you've presented. Step 2. Examine the judgments. Track every judgment you make about people who aren't empathic. Every time you think someone is cold, shut down, unaware, disconnected, selfish, emotionally primitive, write it down. These judgments reveal your shadow projections. The qualities you judge in others are often the disowned parts of yourself that threaten your empathic identity. Step 3. Investigate the investment. Ask yourself honestly, what do I get from being an empath? Importance, specialness, justification for dysfunction, excuse for avoiding adult responsibilities, community, identity. The more you're invested in the empathic identity, the more shadow work is required to integrate what that investment is actually about. Step 4. Confront the martyr complex. Examine how you use suffering to create importance. How does your empathic overwhelm make you significant? How does carrying others' emotions position you as more noble? How does your sensitivity justify special treatment? The martyr complex is shadow because it hides superiority behind victimhood. Step 5. Integrate the ordinariness. This is the hardest part. You have to accept that you're not special because you're sensitive. You're just a person with unhealed trauma that created specific patterns. Your sensitivity doesn't prove evolution. It reveals wounding. And accepting your ordinariness, that you're just as limited, flawed, and developing as everyone else, is the depth required for integration. Jung wrote his most crucial insight about shadow work. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The darkness in empathic identity is the hidden superiority, the covert judgment, the subtle narcissism. And making it conscious feels like destruction of self because it is. Destruction of the false self constructed on spiritual ego. Michael told me something 6 months into shadow integration work. He said, "I thought being an empath made me special. Now I realize it just made me insufferable. I was so busy judging everyone for being less sensitive that I couldn't form genuine relationships. I was so invested in my superiority that I couldn't see my own emotional immaturity." The hardest truth? People who maintain boundaries aren't less evolved, they're more evolved. They developed what I never did. This is the mirror effect for this truth. People you judge as unaware or emotionally stunted or disconnected are reflecting disowned aspects of your own psyche. The person who doesn't cry easily, they might have healthier emotional regulation than your empathic flooding. The person who maintains boundaries, they have psychic structure you lack. The person who focuses on themselves, they've developed self-relationship you sacrificed. Every judgment reveals shadow, parts of yourself you can't integrate, because they threaten your empathic superiority. When you integrate the empath shadow, something remarkable happens. Humility emerges. Not the false humility of "I'm so burdened by my gift," but genuine humility, the recognition that you're just a person on a developmental journey, wounded in specific ways, with specific work to do. No more special, no more evolved, no more superior, just human. And from that humility, authentic compassion becomes possible for the first time. Because real compassion doesn't come from feeling superior to others. It comes from recognizing your own limitations, your own wounds, your own shadow, and extending to others the understanding you're learning to give yourself. I'll warn you, integrating your empath shadow will dismantle your special identity. You'll lose the community that reinforced your superiority. You'll lose the justification for judgment. You'll lose the importance through suffering. That loss will initially feel like annihilation because you've built so much of your self-worth on being the sensitive one, the evolved one, the aware one. But what emerges on the other side is something infinitely more valuable: actual humility. The capacity to relate to others as equals instead of from a superior position. The freedom to stop performing sensitivity and start developing genuine compassion. The liberation from constantly proving your evolution through your suffering. Jung knew, individuation requires shadow integration. You cannot become whole while rejecting parts of yourself. And the empathic shadow, that hidden superiority, that covert judgment, that subtle narcissism, it's part of you, not the best part, not the part you want to claim, but part of you nonetheless. And acknowledging it, integrating it, allowing it into consciousness where it can be transformed, that's the work. So here's the question that begins integration. What would you lose if you accepted that your empathic sensitivity doesn't make you more evolved than others? What would collapse if you acknowledged that your absorption is dysfunction, not advancement? What identity would die if you admitted that people with boundaries aren't less developed? They're more developed. Whatever you'd lose, that specialness, that superiority, that importance through suffering, that's the shadow keeping you trapped in empathic identity. And releasing it is the doorway to genuine development, authentic compassion, and the humility that makes real spiritual growth possible. The liberation isn't in claiming you're special because you're sensitive. The liberation is in accepting you're human despite your sensitivity, and that acceptance, that radical ordinariness, is the foundation of authentic, compassionate presence that serves instead of judges, that meets instead of merges, that honors instead of hierarchizes. Your shadow is showing. Can you see it yet? There's a concept at the very heart of Carl Jung's entire life work, a concept so central that everything he wrote, everything he discovered, everything he taught was ultimately in service of this one psychological process. He called it individuation. And if you understand nothing else about Jung, understand this. Individuation was, to him, the fundamental purpose of human existence. The reason we're here, the goal of psychological development, the journey from unconscious merging with the collective to becoming a separate, whole, integrated individual. And empathic absorption makes individuation impossible. Let me introduce you to Sophia, 45 years old, successful in her career, well-liked, spiritual, an empath who prided herself on deep connection with others. But sitting in a Jung-oriented therapy session one afternoon, her therapist asked her a simple question. "Sophia, who are you?" She started to answer, "I'm a mother, a friend, a daughter, a healer." Her therapist interrupted, "No, not your roles, not what you do for others. Who are you? What do you want? What do you feel? What are your authentic desires separate from everyone you're merged with?" Sophia opened her mouth to respond. Nothing came out. She sat there for 10 minutes in silence, tears streaming down her face, and finally whispered, "I have no idea. I don't know who I am. I've spent my entire life merged with other people, feeling their feelings, wanting what they want, becoming what they need. And I've never once asked myself who I actually am." This is the fourth truth, and it addresses Jung's central concept directly. Chronic empathic absorption makes individuation impossible because you cannot become a separate, whole individual while you remain perpetually merged with others. Jung defined individuation as the process of psychological integration, the journey of becoming an individual, a separate self, a whole person who is differentiated from the collective unconscious while maintaining conscious relationship with it. It's not about isolation or selfishness. It's about developing into who you actually are instead of remaining an undifferentiated fragment of the collective. And here's what Jung understood, that modern empath culture refuses to acknowledge. You cannot individuate while chronically absorbed in others. You cannot become yourself while you're merged with everyone else. You cannot develop a separate consciousness while your attention is perpetually externalized into other people's psychic space. Empathic absorption is, by definition, the opposite of individuation. It's remaining in what Jung called parentification mystique, that primitive state of consciousness, where the individual hasn't separated from the collective, where self and other blur into undifferentiated unity. Jung observed this state in tribal cultures where individual consciousness hadn't yet differentiated from group identity, and he saw it as a developmental stage that human consciousness was meant to evolve beyond. But empathic absorption keeps you locked in parentification mystique. You never form a stable, separate self because you're constantly merged with others. You never develop clear boundaries because absorption requires boundary dissolution. You never discover your authentic desires because you're too busy absorbing everyone else's. You never face your own shadow because you're perpetually processing others' darkness. You never become who you actually are because you're too fragmented across everyone you're merged with. Let's break down exactly why absorption blocks. Individuation, blockage 1. No stable ego formation. Jung distinguished between ego and self. The ego is your conscious sense of I, the center of consciousness, the part that says, "This is me." The self is the totality of the psyche, including unconscious contents. Individuation requires a strong, stable ego as the mediator between consciousness and the unconscious. But empathic absorption prevents stable ego formation because there's no consistent I to stabilize. You're constantly shifting, merging, absorbing, becoming whoever you're around. Your ego identity is fluid, dependent on others, never solidifying into a separate center of consciousness. Blockage 2. Chronic external focus. Individuation requires turning inward. Jung called it withdrawing libido from the external world to explore the inner landscape. But empaths are chronically externally focused, attention perpetually directed outward toward others' emotional states. The inward turn that's essential for individuation never happens because all psychic energy flows outward through empathic absorption. You can't explore your inner world if you're always in everyone else's. Blockage 3. Self-abandonment pattern. Individuation is fundamentally about becoming yourself, discovering your authentic nature, your unique personality, your individual path. But empathic absorption is predicated on self-abandonment. You abandon your own needs, ignore your own emotions, sacrifice your own desires to merge with others. Every act of empathic absorption reinforces that yourself doesn't matter as much as others' selves, and you cannot individuate while simultaneously abandoning the very self you're supposed to be becoming. Blockage 4. Identity through others. Jung taught that individuation means discovering your identity from within, rather than deriving it from external sources. But empaths define themselves through relationships, through absorption, through merging. I'm an empath is an identity based on your relationship to others' emotions. I absorb energy is a self-concept dependent on external input. You can't develop independent identity while your entire sense of self requires other people to exist. Blockage 5. Avoided shadow work. This is crucial. Empaths often avoid their own shadow work by processing others' darkness. You absorb someone's rage, process it, feel like you've done deep psychological work, but it was their material, not yours. You take on someone's shame, work through it, believe you've integrated shadow, but the shadow you integrated was theirs, not your own. Empathic absorption becomes a sophisticated way to avoid the painful confrontation with your own shadow that individuation requires. Jung wrote, "Individuation means becoming an individual, and insofar as individuality embraces our innermost, last, and incomparable uniqueness, it also implies becoming one's own self." We could therefore translate individuation as coming to selfhood or self-realization. Read that again. Your innermost, last, and incomparable uniqueness. How can you discover that while you're merged with everyone else? How can you realize your unique self while you're chronically absorbed in others' psyches? How can you become an individual, literally undivided, while you're perpetually divided across every person you encounter? Sophia began the painful work of individuation at age 45. She had to start asking questions she'd never considered. What do I actually want, separate from what everyone else wants from me? What do I feel when I'm not absorbing someone else's emotions? What are my authentic desires when I'm not merged with my partners, my children's, my friends? Who am I when I'm not being the empath, the helper, the absorber? These questions terrified her because they revealed a void. 45 years of empathic merging had prevented the formation of a separate self. There was no Sophia underneath the absorption patterns. Or rather, there was, but she'd never developed, never been allowed consciousness, never been given space to emerge. Jung taught about what he called withdrawing projections, the essential work of recognizing that what you perceive in others is actually content from your own unconscious. This is fundamental to individuation because you can't know yourself while your own psychic material is split off and projected onto others. But empaths live in perpetual projection. You experience your own emotional content as if it's coming from others. You project your rage and experience it as absorbing theirs. You project your grief and feel it as theirs. You project your terror and sense it as environmental. All of your own psychic material gets externalized through empathic absorption, making self-knowledge impossible. Individuation requires pulling all those projections back, recognizing that what you've been experiencing as out there is actually in here, that the emotions you've been absorbing are yours, that the darkness you've been processing is your own shadow, that the overwhelm you've been experiencing isn't from external sources, but from your own unintegrated psychic content flooding consciousness, because you have no ego structure to mediate it. I need to share my own individuation blockage, because this work requires vulnerability. I spent decades believing I was deeply self-aware because I could articulate complex emotional states. But in therapy, I discovered something shocking. Every emotion I could articulate was one I'd absorbed and processed from someone else. When asked about my own emotions, the ones that arose from my own psyche, not from empathic absorption, I had no language, no awareness, no access. I'd been so chronically merged with others that I'd never developed my own emotional vocabulary. I knew intimately what rage felt like because I'd absorbed my father's. I understood depression deeply because I'd processed my mother's. I could describe anxiety with precision because I'd taken on my partner's. But my own emotions, I couldn't identify them because I'd spent my life dissociating from them through empathic absorption. Starting individuation at age 37 felt like being born. I had to learn to recognize my own feelings. I had to discover my own desires. I had to identify my own needs. Things that individuated people learn in childhood, I was learning as an adult because empathic merging had prevented that development. Jung described individuation as occurring in stages, and understanding these stages reveals exactly how empathic absorption prevents the journey. Stage 1. Confrontation with the persona. The persona is the mask we wear for society, the adapted self we present to the world. Individuation begins when you recognize the persona isn't your true self, just a role you've been playing. But empaths often can't even reach this stage because they don't have a stable persona. They have multiple personas that shift depending on who they're merged with. Your persona with your mother is different from your persona with your partner is different from your persona with your friends. You're so busy adapting to everyone through absorption that you never stabilize a consistent persona to eventually see through. Stage 2. Encounter with the shadow. Once you've seen through the persona, you confront the shadow, those aspects of yourself you've rejected and pushed into unconsciousness. But empaths avoid their own shadow by processing others. You encounter darkness, but it's always framed as someone else's. Your rage is their rage. Your shame is their shame. Your darkness is absorbed from others, so you never do the terrifying work of confronting your own shadow as your own. Stage 3. Meeting the anima animus. Jung taught about the contrasexual archetype, the feminine in men, anima, the masculine in women, animus. Individuation requires integrating these inner figures, but empaths often project these archetypes onto partners, then merge with the projection. Women empaths often lose themselves in masculine partners, absorbing and becoming what they've projected. Men empaths often merge with feminine partners, experiencing their anima through absorption rather than integration. The inner work of integrating opposites gets externalized into relationship merging. Stage 4. Realization of the self. The final stage is encountering the self, that totality of psyche that transcends and includes ego, shadow, and all unconscious contents. This is the goal of individuation, becoming whole, integrated, truly yourself. But you cannot realize the self while you're dissolved into others. The self requires a strong, differentiated ego to mediate between consciousness and the unconscious. Empathic absorption prevents both ego strength and differentiation, making self-realization impossible. Sophia spent 2 years just in stage 1, developing a consistent sense of self that wasn't dependent on who she was with. She had to learn to notice when she was adapting, absorbing, merging. She had to practice staying with her own center, even when empathic urges pulled her toward others. She had to build, for the first time in her life, a stable I that existed independent of others' needs. She told me, "It felt like learning to walk. Every step toward individuation triggered terror because my whole sense of safety was built on merging. Being separate felt dangerous, but slowly I started to feel something I'd never experienced: presence in my own life. I was actually here in my own experience instead of scattered across everyone else's." Jung wrote about what he called the individuation blockage that empaths experience. You remain in participation mystique, primitive identification where you haven't differentiated from collective consciousness. In tribes, Jung observed, individuals don't think of themselves as separate from the tribe. Their identity is collective. Their consciousness is merged. And empaths live in this same state. Identity merged with family, with partners, with community. Never separate, never individual, never differentiated. Here's the mirror effect for this truth. People you judge for being selfish or individualistic or self-focused possess the differentiation that's essential for wholeness. They've completed developmental work that empathic absorption prevented you from doing. They know who they are independent of others. They have clear desires, boundaries, sense of self. And your judgment of their selfishness is actually recognition of the individuation you've failed to achieve while calling that failure empathic gifting. The person who says, "I need space," isn't avoiding intimacy. They're maintaining the separate self required for genuine intimacy. The person who prioritizes their own needs isn't selfish. They're individuated. The person who doesn't absorb your emotions isn't cold. They're differentiated. And every judgment you make reveals your own developmental arrest, disguised as spiritual superiority. I need to be explicit about what individuation requires for empaths, because this is the path forward. First, you must develop a stable ego. This means creating a consistent sense of I that doesn't shift based on who you're with. You must learn to answer, "Who am I?" without referencing relationships, roles, or what you do for others. You must build a center of consciousness that remains stable even when you're alone. Second, you must withdraw projections. Every emotion you think you're absorbing from others must be investigated as potential projection. Is this actually their rage, or my rage projected onto them? Is this their grief, or my grief externalized through empathic sensing? Pulling back projections is painful because it means acknowledging that the emotional overwhelm you've attributed to your environment is actually your own unintegrated psychic content. Third, you must confront your own shadow, not others' shadow that you've absorbed, but your own. The rage you've never acknowledged, the selfishness you've denied, the cruelty you've rejected, the superiority you've hidden, all of it. Your shadow, your darkness, not borrowed from others, but arising from your own psyche. Fourth, you must discover your authentic desires. What do you actually want when you're not merged with what others want? What calls to you from your own depths, not from empathic absorption of others' callings? This requires solitude, separation, the courage to be alone with yourself long enough to hear your own voice. Fifth, you must accept the loneliness. Individuation is lonely. Jung was explicit about this. When you differentiate from the collective, you lose the comfort of merging. You can't go back to unconscious participation mystique once you've begun individuating. The loneliness of becoming yourself is the price of consciousness. And for empaths who have built entire lives around merging, this loneliness feels like death. Sophia told me something profound in her 3rd year of individuation work. She said, "I lost almost everyone. My empath friends couldn't relate to me anymore because I stopped absorbing and complaining about overwhelm. My family was confused because I wasn't managing everyone's emotions. My partner left because our entire relationship was built on me being merged with her, and individuation meant I couldn't be that anymore. I was more alone than I'd ever been, but I was also more myself than I'd ever been. And I finally understood what Jung meant. You can't become yourself while remaining merged with everyone else. The journey requires loss. It requires grief. It requires the courage to be alone. But what you gain, authentic selfhood, is worth everything you lose. This is what Jung called the privilege of a lifetime, becoming who you truly are, not who others need you to be, not who you become through absorption, but who you actually are in your innermost, unique, incomparable essence. Empathic absorption prevents that privilege. It keeps you perpetually merged, perpetually external, perpetually avoiding the inward journey that individuation requires. And every moment spent absorbed in others is a moment stolen from becoming yourself. So here's the devastating question that begins individuation. Who would you be if you stopped absorbing others' emotions? If you pulled back all projections? If you faced your own shadow? If you discovered your authentic desires? If you developed a separate self? The answer is you don't know. You've never met that person. You've spent your entire life merged with others, and the individuated you, the separate, whole, integrated you, has never had space to emerge. Jung understood. You cannot become who you already are. You must become who you actually are beneath the adaptations, the merging, the absorption patterns. And that becoming requires sacrificing the empathic identity that's prevented individuation while claiming to be a spiritual gift. Are you ready for that sacrifice? Because once you choose individuation, there's no going back to unconscious merging. There's only the lonely, necessary, sacred journey of becoming yourself. And that journey, it's the only one that matters. There's a pattern that plays out in empaths' relationships with such predictable precision that once you see it, you can't unsee it. And that pattern reveals something uncomfortable. Empathic absorption doesn't just happen randomly. It gets carefully constructed and maintained through specific relationship dynamics that ensure the empath always has something to absorb, someone to fix, emotional content to avoid facing in themselves. Let me introduce you to Jennifer and Mark. They've been together for 7 years. Jennifer is a self-identified empath who absorbs Mark's emotions constantly. She can sense when he's upset before he knows it himself. She takes on his anxiety, processes his anger, carries his depression. She's exhausted, overwhelmed, burned out, but she also describes their connection as deeply spiritual and more real than anything I've experienced. Mark, for his part, is emotionally unavailable. He doesn't talk about his feelings. He shuts down when things get intense. He withdraws into work, hobbies, anything to avoid emotional vulnerability. And Jennifer absorbs everything he won't express, feels everything he won't acknowledge, processes everything he won't face. In their first couples therapy session, the therapist said something that shocked them both. "You've created a perfect codependent system. Jennifer, you need Mark to be emotionally unavailable so you have something to absorb and fix. Mark, you need Jennifer to absorb your emotions so you never have to develop your own emotional capacity. Neither of you is in a relationship with a separate person. You're in relationship with your own unhealed patterns. using each other to maintain those patterns while calling it deep connection. This is the fifth truth, and it's going to expose how empathic absorption creates and maintains pathological relationship dynamics. Empaths unconsciously seek relationships that confirm their identity by choosing partners who provide endless emotional content to absorb, creating codependent systems both people mistake for intimacy. Jung spent significant time exploring relationship as what he called the alchemical vessel, the container in which two individuated beings could create something greater than themselves through conscious union. But he was explicit. This alchemical transformation requires two separate whole people. Without individuation, relationship becomes not a vessel for transformation, but a prison of mutual wounding, where each person uses the other to avoid facing themselves. And empathic relationships are the perfect example of this prison. They look like depth and connection on the surface. They feel intense and meaningful. But underneath, they're elaborate codependent systems designed to ensure both people can avoid the individuation work each desperately needs. Let's break down the empathic relationship pattern, because understanding this dynamic requires seeing each stage. Stage 1. Attraction to emotional unavailability. Empaths don't randomly choose partners. They're attracted to specific types, usually people who are emotionally unavailable, wounded, narcissistic, or shut down. Why? Because these partners create the perfect conditions for empathic absorption. An emotionally available partner who expresses feelings, maintains boundaries, and handles their own emotional content. That partner doesn't give the empath anything to absorb. There's no dysfunction to fix, no emotions to process, no merging to engage in. So empaths unconsciously seek partners who have abundant, unexpressed emotional content for them to sense, absorb, and process. Stage 2. Rapid enmeshment. Once the empath finds an emotionally unavailable partner, the relationship moves quickly into enmeshment. Boundaries dissolve. The empath begins absorbing the partner's emotional content. They merge psychically, energetically, emotionally. The empath interprets this merging as deep connection, soul recognition, spiritual partnership. The unavailable partner experiences it as someone who finally understands them without requiring emotional vulnerability. Both people get what they unconsciously need. The empath gets someone to absorb and fix. The partner gets someone to manage their emotions for them. Stage 3. Caretaker role. The empath quickly assumes the role of emotional caretaker in the relationship. They sense when the partner is upset. They absorb the partner's anxiety. They process the partner's anger. They manage the partner's emotional states. And this role feels essential, important, like evidence of their love and their gift. The empath believes they're being supportive, helpful, deeply caring. In reality, they're preventing their partner from developing emotional capacity while simultaneously defining themselves through caretaking. Stage 4. Emotional responsibility. Here's where the codependency deepens. The empath becomes responsible for the partner's emotional well-being. If the partner is angry, the empath absorbs and manages it. If the partner is depressed, the empath takes it on and tries to fix it. If the partner is anxious, the empath processes it for them. The partner never has to develop their own emotional regulation because the empath does it for them. And the empath never has to face their own emotions because they're too busy managing the partner's. Stage 5. Resentment buildup. Eventually, the empath begins to resent the partner. They're exhausted from constant absorption. They're overwhelmed by managing another person's emotional life. They feel unappreciated, taken advantage of, drained, but they don't leave. Instead, they double down on the empathic absorption, believing that if they just try harder, absorb more, fix better, the partner will finally be healed and the relationship will work. The resentment gets pushed underground, occasionally erupting in passive-aggressive behavior or emotional breakdowns. Stage 6. Crisis cycle. The relationship settles into a pattern of crisis and resolution. The partner has an emotional episode, anger outburst, depressive collapse, anxiety attack. The empath absorbs it, processes it, manages it. There's a period of calm, then another crisis, another absorption, another exhaustion, another resolution. The cycle becomes the relationship, and both people mistake intensity for depth, crisis for connection, codependence for intimacy. Stage 7. Reinforcement. The partner becomes increasingly dependent on the empath's emotional caretaking. They lose whatever emotional capacity they once had because they don't need it. The empath handles everything. And this dependence confirms the empath's identity as essential, needed, important. The pattern reinforces itself. The more the empath absorbs, the less the partner develops. The less the partner develops, the more the empath absorbs. The more the empath absorbs, the more essential they become. The more essential they become, the more trapped they are in the pattern. Jennifer recognized herself in every stage. She'd been attracted to Mark specifically because he was emotionally shut down, though she would have said she was attracted to his depth and complexity. She'd merged with him rapidly, interpreting boundary dissolution as connection. She'd taken on the caretaker role, believing it was love. She'd become responsible for his emotional states, thinking it was supportive. She'd built up years of resentment while simultaneously intensifying her absorption. They'd cycled through crisis after crisis, each one seeming to prove how much he needed her. And through it all, she'd told herself, this was what empaths do. This was her gift. This was deep connection. The possibility that she was in a codependent relationship maintaining both people's dysfunction never occurred to her because the spiritual marketplace had told her that empathic absorption in relationship was evidence of soul connection, twin flame union, sacred partnership. Jung understood relationship differently. He taught about the conjunctio, the sacred marriage of opposites, within the self that must occur before healthy relationship is possible. The conjunctio is an internal process where you integrate the masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious, light and shadow within yourself. Only after achieving this internal integration can you meet another person in genuine relationship. But empaths seek externally what can only be found internally. They look for completion through merging with another person instead of through integrating their own psyche. They try to achieve wholeness through absorption instead of individuation. And the result is codependency, two incomplete people using each other to avoid the inner work of becoming whole. Jung wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." This is what he meant by true relationship, two separate substances creating transformation through contact. But empathic relationships aren't two separate substances making contact. They're two substances dissolving into one undifferentiated mass. There's no transformation because there's no separation. There's just fusion. I need to share my own relationship pattern because confronting this requires honesty. I spent 15 years in a relationship with someone who was profoundly emotionally unavailable. I absorbed her anger, processed her depression, managed her anxiety. I told myself I was being loving, supportive, empathically present. The truth? I was maintaining codependency because it allowed me to avoid my own emotions while feeling important through caretaking. When I finally started developing boundaries and stopped absorbing her emotions, the relationship ended within 3 months. She told me I'd become cold, disconnected, selfish. I'd changed. I wasn't the person she fell in love with, and she was right, I wasn't. The person she fell in love with was a boundaryless empath, whose identity required her emotional unavailability, so I could absorb and fix and feel essential. When I individuated enough to stop that pattern, there was no relationship left because the relationship was built entirely on codependent dynamics, not on two separate people meeting in conscious connection. That loss devastated me. It also liberated me, because I finally understood what Jung meant. You cannot have genuine relationship without individuation. Two people who haven't become themselves cannot create authentic connection. They can create enmeshment, fusion, codependency, but not relationship in the sacred sense Jung described. Here's what empaths need to understand about their relationship patterns. You're attracted to dysfunction because dysfunction gives you someone to fix. Healthy, emotionally available people don't need empathic absorption. They manage their own emotions, express their own needs, maintain their own boundaries. If you find yourself consistently attracted to wounded, unavailable, or narcissistic partners, it's not bad luck. It's unconscious partner selection designed to maintain your empathic identity. You interpret enmeshment as intimacy, the rapid merging, the boundary dissolution, the constant absorption. You experience this as deep connection, but it's not intimacy. Intimacy requires two separate selves revealing themselves to each other. Enmeshment is the opposite, two people merging to avoid the terror of being separate. You prevent your partner's growth through caretaking. Every time you absorb your partner's emotions, instead of letting them feel their own, you're preventing their development. Every time you manage their emotional states, you're keeping them emotionally infantilized. Your empathic absorption isn't helping them, it's disabling them. You avoid your own development through absorption. While you're focused on your partner's emotions, you're not feeling your own. While you're processing their anger, you're dissociating from your rage. While you're managing their needs, you're ignoring your desires. The relationship becomes an elaborate avoidance mechanism that keeps both people stuck. Your resentment is self-betrayal manifesting. The resentment you feel toward your partner isn't about them taking advantage of you. It's about you betraying yourself by abandoning your boundaries, ignoring your needs, sacrificing your selfhood to maintain the caretaker role that confirms your identity. Jennifer worked with her therapist for a year, developing boundaries and stopping the absorption pattern with Mark. She learned to say, "I sense you're upset, but I'm not going to absorb it or manage it for you. I'm here if you want to talk about it, but I'm not taking it on." She learned to focus on her own emotional content instead of his. She learned to maintain her center instead of merging. Mark had two choices: develop his own emotional capacity or leave. The relationship that was built on Jennifer absorbing his emotions couldn't survive Jennifer's individuation. For 6 months, Mark tried to pull Jennifer back into the old pattern. He had emotional crises designed to trigger her empathic absorption. He accused her of being cold, selfish, no longer the woman he loved. He threatened to leave. Jennifer held her boundaries. She stayed in her own center. She refused to absorb his emotions or manage his states. And slowly, something remarkable happened. Mark began developing emotional capacity. He started feeling his own anger instead of suppressing it until Jennifer absorbed it. He learned to identify his anxiety instead of remaining unconscious until Jennifer sensed it. He began talking about his feelings instead of withdrawing until Jennifer merged with his unexpressed content. Their relationship transformed. It became, for the first time, a relationship between two separate people instead of one person absorbed into another. The intensity decreased. The crisis cycles stopped. The depth that emerged was different from the intensity they'd mistaken for connection. Quieter, more stable, more real. But Jennifer told me something important. Most empathic relationships can't survive this transformation. When you stop absorbing, the relationship that was built entirely on codependency has no foundation left. And your partner, who chose you specifically because you'd manage their emotions, will likely leave to find another empath who will maintain the pattern. That's not failure. That's recognizing that what you called relationship was actually mutual wounding dressed up as spiritual connection. Here's the mirror effect. For this truth, partners you attract reflect your own level of individuation. Undifferentiated people attract undifferentiated partners. The emotionally unavailable partner you keep choosing, they're matching your own level of emotional development. The narcissistic partner who uses your empathy, they're reflecting your own unintegrated narcissism disguised as sensitivity. The wounded partner you keep trying to fix, they're showing you your own wounding that you refuse to address by focusing on theirs. Jung understood, healthy relationship requires two whole people, not two wounded people using each other's wounds to avoid healing, not two undifferentiated people merging to avoid individuation, but two separate, integrated beings choosing conscious connection while maintaining sovereignty. Empathic relationships prevent this possibility. They're built on fusion, not connection, on codependency, not partnership, on mutual wounding, not mutual growth, and transforming them requires what feels like death. The death of the relationship as it's been, the willingness to lose the partner if they can't tolerate your boundaries, the courage to be alone rather than merged. I'll warn you, developing boundaries will end relationships built on enmeshment. When you stop absorbing your partner's emotions, when you maintain your own center, when you refuse to manage their emotional states, the relationship that required your absorption will collapse, and you'll have to choose. Return to the pattern to save the relationship, or continue individuating even if it means being alone. Jung knew sometimes the relationship must end for the individuals to begin. Sometimes the fusion must dissolve for authentic selfhood to emerge. Sometimes you must lose the person you're merged with to find the person you actually are. The question is, are you willing to lose your relationship to gain yourself? Because that's what authentic development requires. And if the relationship can't survive your wholeness, it was never serving your growth. It was preventing it. Let me tell you about Thomas. 32 years old, couldn't go to grocery stores without debilitating overwhelm. Couldn't attend concerts, festivals, gatherings. Couldn't be in crowds without feeling like he was drowning in everyone's emotions. He described it as being energetically assaulted, as absorbing every feeling in the environment until he couldn't function. For years, he managed this by avoiding public spaces. He worked from home. He ordered groceries online. He lived a carefully controlled life designed to minimize exposure to others' energy. And he believed this was his cross to bear as an empath, that he was simply too sensitive for this harsh world, cursed with perceiving what others didn't, overwhelmed by gifts he never asked for. Then, in a Jung-oriented somatic therapy session, his therapist said something that changed everything. Thomas, you don't have too much sensitivity. You have an undeveloped psychic immune system. The overwhelm you experience isn't because you're absorbing everyone's emotions. It's because you never developed the psychological structures that filter, process, and protect consciousness from being flooded. What you're experiencing isn't gifting. It's a developmental deficit that can be healed. This is the sixth truth, and it's going to reframe empathic overwhelm from spiritual curse to psychological wound. Empathic overwhelm is not evidence of superior sensitivity. It's evidence of an undeveloped or damaged psychic immune system, the psychological structures that should have formed in childhood to protect consciousness from flooding. Jung understood that the healthy psyche has natural defenses, not walls that shut everything out, but intelligent filtering systems that distinguish what's yours from what's others, process intense emotional content without being destroyed, Maintain sense of self in collective spaces. Extend toward others consciously, then return to center screen, incoming psychic information for relevance and intensity. These defenses form during childhood. Through healthy attachment and appropriate boundaries, the child learns, this is me, that is you. I can feel with you without becoming you. I can be in intense emotional environments without losing myself. I can process difficult emotions without being shattered. But when childhood involves boundary violations, emotional parentification, or trauma, these psychic defenses don't form properly, or they form weakly, or they're actively dismantled by caregivers who need the child to remain porous, absorptive, merged. The result? An adult who experiences emotional overwhelm not because they're more sensitive than others, but because they lack the psychic immune system that would make normal sensitivity functional rather than debilitating. Let's break down the psychic immune system components because understanding what's missing is the first step toward developing it. Component 1. Boundary recognition. This is the foundational structure, knowing where you end and others begin. Healthy psyches have clear internal sense of self and other. They can be in relationship without merging. They can feel empathy without absorption. Empaths lack this structure. Their boundaries are porous or non-existent. They don't have clear distinction between self and other, so every emotional signal they encounter enters their system as if it's their own. Component 2. Emotional differentiation. Once you recognize boundaries exist, you need the capacity to distinguish your feelings from others. This is a specific skill. Feeling someone else's anger in the environment while recognizing it's not your anger. Sensing someone's sadness while knowing it's their sadness, not yours. Healthy psyches do this automatically. Empaths never learned how. Every emotion they sense gets immediately internalized, processed as if it originated in their own psyche, creating the overwhelm they mistake for absorption. Component 3. Processing capacity. The psyche needs the ability to metabolize intense emotions without being destroyed by them. Think of it like digestion. A healthy system can break down and integrate nutrients, eliminate waste, maintain functioning. A damaged digestive system gets overwhelmed by normal food. Similarly, a healthy psychic immune system can process intense emotions, grief, rage, terror, without systemic collapse. An undeveloped system gets flooded by normal emotional intensity, experiencing it as overwhelming, traumatic, unmanageable. Component 4. Return mechanism. This is crucial. The ability to extend consciousness toward another person or environment, then return to your own center. Like breathing. Exhale outward, inhale back to center. Healthy empathy works this way. You extend awareness toward someone's experience. Feel with them momentarily, then return to yourself. Empaths get stuck in the extension. They go outward and can't get back. They merge and can't separate. The return mechanism never developed, so every empathic extension becomes permanent absorption. Component 5. Protective filters. The psyche needs intelligent screening systems that determine what's relevant to process and what to let pass through without engaging. Not everything deserves your attention. Not every emotional signal requires processing. Healthy psyches automatically filter, this is important, this isn't. This is mine to address, this isn't. This requires response, this doesn't. Empaths lack these filters. Everything comes in with equal intensity. Every emotional signal demands processing. There's no discrimination between what's relevant and what's environmental noise. Thomas had none of these components functioning. His boundaries were dissolved from childhood emotional parentification. His differentiation capacity was destroyed by years of absorbing his mother's anxiety. His processing capacity was overwhelmed because he'd never learned to metabolize emotions in appropriate doses. His return mechanism was damaged. He could extend toward others but couldn't get back to himself. And his filters were non-existent. Everything flooded in with equal intensity. The grocery store overwhelm he experienced, it wasn't absorption of everyone's emotions. It was environmental emotional information flooding a system with no filters, no boundaries, no processing capacity, like trying to drink from a fire hose when you don't have a functioning digestive system. Jung wrote, "A man who has not passed through the inferno of his passions has never overcome them." What he meant is that we must learn to face intense emotion, to move through it, to metabolize it. But empaths haven't passed through. They've been flooded repeatedly without ever learning to swim. They've been overwhelmed so many times that overwhelm becomes their baseline, and they develop an identity around it rather than the skills to transform it. I need to share my own psychic immune system damage because this is deeply personal. My childhood involved constant emotional flooding, my father's alcoholic rages, my mother's depressive collapses, neither parent able to regulate their own states. My developing psyche needed protection, boundaries, filtration. Instead, I got flooded daily with intensity I had no capacity to process. By adulthood, I couldn't be in any emotionally charged environment without complete overwhelm. Restaurants, airports, family gatherings, anywhere with multiple people meant drowning in what I believed was their energy. I developed elaborate protection rituals. I wore crystals, visualized white light, practiced energy clearing. I did everything except address the actual problem. I had an undeveloped psychic immune system that needed to be built, not defended. The turning point came when a somatic therapist said, "You're not protecting yourself from others' energy. You're trying to manage a nervous system that was traumatized into permanent hypervigilance and never learned to regulate. Stop doing protection rituals and start developing actual psychological structures." That reframe changed everything, because protection rituals reinforced the belief that I was a victim of others' energy. But developing psychic immunity put agency back in my system. I could learn what I'd never been taught. I could build what had never formed. I could develop in adulthood what should have happened in childhood. Here's the psychic immune system development protocol, the practical steps Thomas and I and thousands of others have used to build what empathic wounding prevented. Step 1, boundary recognition training. This starts with body awareness. Your body has clear boundaries, skin marks where you end, and the environment begins. Practice feeling your physical boundaries. Notice the edge of your skin. Feel the space your body occupies. Then extend this awareness to your emotional and energetic boundaries. Where does your emotional experience end? Where does others begin? Practice in safe environments first, alone, then with one trusted person, gradually increasing complexity. Step 2, emotional differentiation practice. When you feel an emotion, pause and ask, "Is this mine?" Not intellectually, but feeling into it. Does this emotion have roots in your history, your current situation, your psyche? Or does it feel foreign, borrowed, absorbed? Mine emotions have context in your life. Absorbed emotions feel free-floating, disconnected from your actual experience. Practice distinguishing these. When you identify absorbed emotion, practice naming it. This is someone else's anger, not mine. Then consciously release it rather than processing it. Step 3, titrated emotion processing. You need to learn to metabolize emotions in manageable doses. Start small. Sit with your own emotions for 5 minutes. Just feel. Don't analyze. Don't fix. Don't absorb anyone else's. Just be with your own emotional content. Gradually increase duration. The goal is building capacity to process intensity without flooding, Like gradually increasing weight in physical training, you're building psychic strength through progressive challenge. Step 4. Return mechanism development. Practice the extend and return movement. Consciously extend awareness toward someone. Feel with them briefly, then consciously return to your own center. Set a timer for 30 seconds. Extend toward their experience. When the timer sounds, return to yourself. Notice the difference between being extended and being centered. Practice this return movement until it becomes automatic. The goal is making extension temporary and conscious, rather than permanent and unconscious. Step 5. Filter installation. This is the most sophisticated component. You're building internal screening systems that determine what requires your attention. Start by identifying your actual responsibilities. What's genuinely yours to feel, process, address. Everything else is environmental information you can acknowledge without absorbing. Practice the mantra, I notice this, but it's not mine to process. You're not becoming cold, you're becoming discerning. Not everything is your responsibility just because you can sense it. Step 6. Nervous system regulation. The psychic immune system is inseparable from nervous system health. Learn vagal regulation techniques. Practice returning your nervous system to baseline after activation. Breathwork, movement, cold exposure, somatic practices, whatever helps your nervous system learn. It can tolerate intensity without staying stuck in hyperarousal. An unregulated nervous system interprets every emotional signal as threat. A regulated system can receive information without emergency response. Step 7. Gradual exposure, like building physical immunity through controlled exposure to pathogens. You build psychic immunity through controlled exposure to emotional environments. Start with low-intensity situations, brief trips to quiet stores, short periods in small groups. Gradually increase complexity as your system learns it can handle intensity without flooding. The goal is teaching your psyche. I can be in emotionally charged environments and maintain my center. Thomas worked this protocol for 18 months. The first 6 months were brutal. His system resisted every change because the empathic overwhelm pattern was what he knew. Building boundaries felt like becoming cold. Differentiating emotions felt like losing his sensitivity. Returning to center felt like abandoning others. Installing filters felt like being selfish. But slowly, something shifted. He went to a grocery store and didn't absorb every emotional signal. He attended a concert and felt the collective energy without drowning in it. He sat in a crowded cafe and maintained his own center while being present to the environment. The overwhelm that had defined his life for 32 years began to decrease, not because he became less sensitive, but because he developed the structures to make sensitivity functional. He told me, I finally understood. I wasn't cursed with too much sensitivity. I was wounded into having no protection. Building a psychic immune system didn't make me less empathic. It made me capable of using empathy consciously instead of being destroyed by it unconsciously. I can still sense emotional information, but now I can choose whether to engage with it. That choice, that's what I was missing. Jung understood what modern empath culture refuses to acknowledge. Overwhelm isn't evidence of spiritual advancement. It's evidence of psychological wounding. The person who can maintain their center in emotionally intense environments isn't less sensitive than the empath who gets flooded. They're more developed. They have the psychic structures that allow sensitivity to function as capacity rather than curse. Here's the mirror effect for this truth. People you judge as cold or shut down or disconnected often have healthy psychic immune systems you misidentify as pathology. The person who can be in a crisis without absorbing it, they have boundaries. The person who can witness suffering without taking it on, they have differentiation capacity. The person who can maintain their center in chaos, They have processing capacity and filters. What you call their deficiency is actually their development. The colleague who doesn't get overwhelmed in intense meetings isn't insensitive. They can tolerate emotional intensity without flooding. The friend who can be present with your grief without absorbing it isn't cold. They have a return mechanism. The family member who doesn't take on everyone's problems isn't selfish. They have filters that distinguish their responsibilities from others. Every judgment reveals your own underdevelopment, and recognizing this is devastating because it means what you've been calling your gift is actually your wound. What you've been framing as spiritual superiority is developmental deficit. What you've been claiming as evidence of evolution is proof of arrested growth. I won't lie to you. Developing a psychic immune system after decades without one is difficult. Your entire identity has been built on overwhelm. Your community bonds over shared absorption. Your sense of importance comes from being too sensitive for this world. Building immunity threatens all of it. You'll lose the empath identity that's made you special. You'll lose the community that reinforced your overwhelm as gifting. You'll lose the excuse for dysfunction that sensitivity provided. You'll lose the martyrdom that made you feel noble. All of it will go as you develop the structures that make you functional instead of flooded. But what you'll gain is agency, the capacity to choose when to extend empathy instead of being involuntarily absorbed, the ability to be in the world without constant protection rituals, the freedom to attend gatherings, travel, live fully instead of constantly managing overwhelm, the stability of maintaining your center, regardless of environmental intensity. Thomas told me something profound 2 years into his development work. I spent 32 years believing I was too sensitive for this world. Now I understand I wasn't sensitive, I was wounded, and that wound can heal. I'm actually more empathic now than I was before because I can be present with intensity instead of being destroyed by it. I can help people more effectively because I'm not drowning in absorption. My sensitivity finally serves me instead of disabling me. This is what's possible. Sensitivity with boundaries, empathy with structure, awareness with filters, compassion with capacity, not the death of your sensitivity, but its maturation from wound into wisdom. Jung knew the psyche wants to heal, it wants to develop, it wants to build what's missing. Your overwhelm isn't permanent destiny, it's arrested development waiting for the attention, the work, the patience to finally complete what childhood prevented. So here's the question that begins development. What would your life look like if you could maintain your sensitivity while building the structures to make it functional? If you could sense emotional information without being flooded? If you could choose when to engage rather than being involuntarily absorbed? If your empathy became capacity instead of curse? The answer is, you'd become what you were always meant to be before wounding hijacked your development. Sensitive without suffering, aware without overwhelm, empathic without absorption, present without merging. This is the liberation, not less sensitivity, more structure, not closing down, building up, not becoming cold, becoming capable. Your psychic immune system is waiting to be developed. The question is, are you ready to release the identity built on its absence? There's a secret that empaths don't want to admit, even to themselves. A truth so uncomfortable that acknowledging it threatens the entire narrative of victimhood and burden that the empath identity is built upon. Here it is. You're addicted to the very overwhelm you claim to hate. Let me introduce you to Amanda, 39 years old, nurse, empath who spent 15 years in crisis, empathic episodes that left her bedbound, dramatic emotional overwhelm that required days of recovery, constant absorption that created chaos in every area of her life, and she hated it, or so she claimed. Then, in a particularly intense therapy session, her therapist asked her to describe a week when nothing dramatic happened. A week without empathic episodes, without emotional crisis, without overwhelming absorption. Amanda tried. She described a week where she went to work, came home, had normal interactions. Nothing intense occurred. Her therapist asked, "How did that week feel?" Amanda paused. Then, with shocking honesty, "Empty, boring, like nothing was happening, like I wasn't really alive." Her therapist leaned forward. "Amanda, what if your empathic episodes aren't something happening to you? What if they're something you unconsciously create because the intensity makes you feel alive, important, real? What if you're addicted to empathic overwhelm because it's the only time you feel like you exist?" Amanda left that session shaken, because if her therapist was right, then everything she'd believed about her empathic suffering was wrong. She wasn't a victim of her sensitivity. She was an addict seeking the intensity that made life feel meaningful, and that truth destroyed everything she'd told herself about who she was. This is the seventh truth, and it's going to confront the uncomfortable reality that empathic identity is often maintained through addiction. Empaths are frequently addicted to emotional intensity, unconsciously seeking and creating the overwhelm they claim to despise because it provides neurochemical rewards, importance, aliveness, and protection from the emptiness of disconnection from authentic self. Jung understood addiction as the psyche's attempt to fill a void, specifically the void left by disconnection from the self. He saw addiction not as moral failing, but as misdirected spiritual hunger. The addict is seeking transcendence, connection, meaning, but through external substances or behaviors rather than through the internal work of individuation. And empathic absorption functions exactly like addiction. It provides temporary neurochemical rewards. It creates the illusion of aliveness. It fills the emptiness left by self-abandonment. It becomes the substitute for authentic self-connection, and like all addictions, it requires increasing doses of intensity to produce the same effect. Let's break down the empathic intensity addiction cycle because understanding this mechanism is essential for breaking free. Stage 1. Emptiness, numbness, baseline. This is where the cycle always starts, with a profound sense of emptiness. Not sadness or grief, but absence. Numbness, a feeling of not really existing, of going through motions without genuine presence. This emptiness is the result of disconnection from authentic self. Years of self-abandonment through empathic absorption have created a void where your actual self should be. You don't know who you are, what you feel, what you want. There's just absence. Stage 2. Seeking external stimulation. The emptiness is intolerable, so the psyche seeks something, anything, to fill it. For empaths, that something is others' emotional intensity. You start scanning for emotional content to absorb. You unconsciously move toward crisis, drama, intensity. You seek out people who are struggling, relationships that are chaotic, situations that are emotionally charged. Not consciously, you still believe you're just trying to help, just too sensitive, just picking up on what's there, but unconsciously, you're seeking the intensity that will fill the void. Stage 3. Overwhelm state. You find intensity or create it, and you absorb. The overwhelm hits. You're flooded with emotion that feels real, alive, meaningful. Your nervous system activates. Adrenaline, cortisol, all the stress chemicals flood your system. And in that overwhelm, you finally feel something. You exist. You matter. You're important. The numbness is gone, replaced by intensity. And intensity feels like life, even when it's destroying you. Stage 4. Crisis identity activation. In the overwhelm, your empath identity fully activates. You're the one who feels too much, who senses too deeply, who carries burdens others can't bear. The overwhelm confirms your specialness. It proves you're different, gifted, more sensitive than normal people. The crisis becomes evidence of your importance. You matter because you're overwhelmed. You exist because you're suffering. Stage 5. Exhaustion crash. Eventually, the overwhelm peaks and you crash. Complete exhaustion. You can't function. You need days to recover. You're depleted, drained, destroyed. And this crash serves a function too. It confirms your martyrdom. You've suffered for others. You've carried their pain. You've sacrificed yourself. The exhaustion proves your nobility, your service, your spiritual advancement through suffering. Stage 6. Brief relief. After the crash comes relief. The nervous system releases calming neurochemicals, endorphins, oxytocin. There's a period of peace, of rest. You tell yourself you'll never absorb that intensely again. You commit to better boundaries, more self-care, protecting yourself. The relief feels like resolution, like you've learned something, like the cycle is broken. Stage 7. Return to emptiness. But then the calming chemicals fade, the relief diminishes, and you're back where you started, empty, numb, disconnected from authentic self. The void returns, and the cycle begins again. You start scanning for intensity. You seek situations that will trigger absorption. You unconsciously create crisis, because the emptiness is worse than the overwhelm. At least in overwhelm, you feel alive. Amanda tracked her patterns for 3 months and discovered something horrifying. She was creating empathic episodes, not consciously, but her behavior revealed the truth. When life felt too stable, she'd reach out to the most emotionally volatile people in her life. When things were calm, she'd pick fights or create drama. When she felt numb, she'd put herself in situations guaranteed to trigger empathic absorption. She wasn't a victim of her sensitivity. She was an addict seeking her fix. And the fix was emotional intensity that made her feel real, important, alive, even while destroying her. Jung wrote about what he called the complex, an autonomous psychic structure that hijacks consciousness and pursues its own agenda, often against the person's stated desires. The empath identity becomes a complex with a specific addiction to emotional intensity as a substitute for authentic self-connection. The complex needs intensity to maintain itself. It will sabotage peace because peace threatens its existence. It will create crisis because crisis confirms its importance. It will seek overwhelm because overwhelm is the only state where it feels real. And all of this happens unconsciously. You genuinely believe you're just trying to help, just too sensitive, just unlucky in relationships. The addiction operating beneath awareness remains invisible. Let me explain the addiction mechanism at the neurochemical level, because understanding this makes the pattern undeniable. Empathic absorption creates a stress response. Your nervous system perceives others' emotions or your projected content experienced as theirs as threat. Stress chemicals release, adrenaline spikes, cortisol floods your system, your heart rate increases, your senses sharpen, you're in fight or flight. For someone disconnected from their authentic self, living in chronic numbness, this activation feels like life itself. The stress response creates intensity, aliveness, mattering. Your body is telling you something important is happening. You exist. You're needed. You're essential. The neurochemical cocktail, while destructive long-term, feels better than emptiness. Then comes the crash. After prolonged stress activation, the nervous system releases calming chemicals, endorphins, dopamine, oxytocin. You feel relief, peace, even euphoria in the exhaustion, like a runner's high after pushing to collapse. These chemicals reward the overwhelm cycle, teaching your nervous system. Intensity followed by crash produces chemical rewards. This is classical addiction neurology. Stress activation, chemical reward, return to baseline, seeking the next hit. Empathic. Absorption becomes the behavior that triggers the neurochemical cascade, and like all addictions, you need increasing intensity to achieve the same effect. What overwhelmed you 5 years ago barely registers now. You need bigger crisis, more dramatic absorption, deeper overwhelm to feel anything. I need to confess my own addiction because confronting this truth requires humility. For years, I created empathic crises. I didn't see it then, but reviewing my patterns made it undeniable. When life felt too stable, I'd reach out to my most volatile friend. When things were peaceful with my partner, I'd create conflict. When I felt numb, I'd put myself in overwhelming environments. I told myself I was just trying to help people, just being available, just too sensitive to avoid intensity. The truth? I was addicted. I needed the overwhelm because it was the only time I felt real. The drama confirmed my importance. The crisis proved I mattered. The absorption gave me identity when I had no sense of authentic self. Recognizing this addiction meant acknowledging I wasn't a noble empath, suffering for others. I was an addict using others' emotions to fill my own emptiness. That recognition shattered my self-concept completely, because if I was addicted to intensity, then every relationship, every crisis, every empathic episode had been unconsciously engineered to feed the addiction. Here are the hidden payoffs that maintain empathic intensity addiction. Payoff 1. Importance. In overwhelm, you matter. You're essential. People need you. Your existence has weight. Without the intensity, you feel invisible, ordinary, insignificant. The addiction gives you importance through suffering. Payoff 2. Specialness. The overwhelm proves you're different, gifted, more sensitive than others. It confirms your unique nature. Without it, you're just another person. The addiction maintains your special identity. Payoff 3. Avoiding own emotions. While absorbed in intensity, you never have to feel your own emotional content. The addiction keeps you externally focused, protecting you from internal confrontation. Payoff 4. Relationship control. Crisis and intensity keep you central in relationships. People orbit around your overwhelm. The addiction ensures you're never abandoned because you're always needed. Payoff 5. Identity confirmation. Every episode confirms you're an empath. The addiction reinforces the identity you've built your life around. Without it, who are you? Payoff 6. Community belonging. Empath communities bond over intensity and overwhelm. Your addiction gives you tribe, connection, belonging. Release it, and you lose your people. Payoff 7. Excuse for dysfunction. The intensity justifies why you can't function normally, why relationships fail, why careers stall, why life never stabilizes. The addiction provides explanation and excuse. Amanda had to confront every payoff. Her empathic episodes made her feel important when she otherwise felt worthless. They proved she was special when she felt ordinary. They kept her from facing her own rage and grief. They maintained her position in relationships as the helper, the needed one, the essential person. They confirmed her empath identity. They gave her community with other overwhelmed empaths. And they explained every failure in her life. She couldn't succeed because she was too sensitive, too burdened, too overwhelmed. Releasing the addiction meant losing all these payoffs. And that loss felt more terrifying than the continued destruction of living in intensity addiction. Jung understood. The psyche doesn't easily release what's serving a function, even when that function is destructive. Shadow integration requires recognizing not just that we have shadow, but what that shadow is doing for us, what need it's meeting, what void it's filling. For empaths, the intensity addiction fills the void left by disconnection from self. It's misdirected spiritual hunger. You're seeking transcendence, aliveness, meaning, but through empathic absorption instead of through individuation. You're trying to feel real through borrowed emotions instead of through authentic self-connection. Jung wrote, "The most dangerous thing is not that we aim too high and miss, but that we aim too low and hit." Empaths aim for intensity as substitute for depth, for crisis as substitute for growth, for overwhelm as substitute for presence, and they hit that target perfectly, achieving intensity, crisis, overwhelm, while missing the actual goal of individuation, wholeness, authentic aliveness. Breaking the addiction requires confronting the emptiness it's been filling, and that emptiness is terrifying because it reveals decades of self-abandonment. All those years absorbed in others meant you never developed yourself. You don't know who you are, what you want, what you feel. There's just void where yourself should be. Sitting with that void without filling it with intensity, that's the work. Learning to tolerate the emptiness, the numbness, the feeling of not existing, while slowly, gradually, painfully, building authentic self-connection that creates genuine aliveness instead of borrowed intensity. Amanda spent a year in what she called the boring desert. She stopped seeking intensity. She stopped creating crisis. She refused empathic absorption, and she faced the emptiness she'd been fleeing her entire life. It was excruciating. Every day felt meaningless. She felt invisible, unimportant, uncertain she even existed. But slowly, something emerged. A quiet sense of presence that wasn't based on intensity. A subtle aliveness that didn't require crisis. A gentle mattering that came from being with herself, not from being absorbed in others. She started recognizing her own desires, her own feelings, her own authentic responses to life. The void began filling, not with borrowed intensity, but with genuine self. She told me, "The addiction gave me false aliveness through intensity. Recovery is teaching me true aliveness through presence. It's quieter, less dramatic, nothing to post about in empath groups, but it's real. I'm finally here in my own life, instead of constantly dissociated into crisis." Here's the mirror effect for this truth. People you judge for being drama-seeking or chaos-addicted are reflecting your own hidden addiction to intensity. You might express it differently. They create relationship drama while you create empathic episodes, but the mechanism is the same. You're both using intensity to fill the void of disconnection from authentic self. The friend who always has some crisis, they're showing you your own pattern. The family member who can't tolerate peace, they're mirroring your addiction. Every judgment reveals what you refuse to see in yourself. I need to warn you, recognizing your intensity addiction will devastate your self-concept. You've told yourself you're a victim of your sensitivity, burdened by gifts you didn't ask for. Seeing that you're actually an addict who unconsciously creates the very overwhelm you claim to hate, that revelation destroys the entire empath narrative. You'll resist this truth with everything you have. You'll find examples that seem to prove you don't seek intensity. You'll argue that your overwhelm is real, not addiction. You'll defend your empath identity against this accusation. That resistance, that's the addiction defending itself. But if you can sit with the discomfort, if you can get brutally honest about your patterns, you'll start seeing it. The way you unconsciously gravitate toward volatile people, the way calm periods make you restless, the way you feel most alive in crisis, the way you create drama when life gets stable, the way you need intensity to feel real. And seeing it is the beginning of freedom. Because addiction can only be healed once it's recognized. Once you see that empathic intensity is your drug, you can begin the recovery work, confronting the emptiness it fills, developing authentic self-connection that provides genuine aliveness, learning to tolerate presence without needing intensity to feel real. Jung knew true aliveness comes from self-connection, not external intensity. The journey is inward, not outward. The answer is presence, not absorption. The liberation is authenticity, not borrowed emotion. So here's the question that begins recovery. What are you seeking through empathic intensity that you could only actually find through authentic self-connection? What void are you trying to fill with crisis that could only be filled by individuation? What aliveness are you seeking through absorption that's only available through presence with your own actual life? The answer is everything. Everything you're seeking through intensity addiction, importance, mattering, aliveness, identity, belonging, meaning, is available through authentic self-development. But you can't access it while you're addicted to the substitute. Release the intensity. Face the void. Do the terrifying work of building genuine self-connection. That's where real aliveness waits. Not in the next empathic crisis, but in the quiet presence with who you actually are. There's a paradox at the heart of empathic identity that no one wants to examine. The very people who most identify with helping others, who build entire lives around being of service, who pride themselves on their capacity to hold space and process pain. These people often provide the least authentic help, not because they don't care, not because their intentions aren't genuine, but because the empathic identity itself prevents the kind of clear, boundaried presence that true service requires. Let me introduce you to Marcus, 47 years old, licensed therapist, healer, self-identified empath who had built a successful practice helping trauma survivors. His clients loved him. They said he understood them in ways no other therapist had. They felt his deep empathy, his willingness to feel their pain with them, his profound sensitivity to their suffering. Then, in his own supervision session, required for maintaining his license, his supervisor reviewed one of his recorded therapy sessions and said something that shook him. "Marcus, you're not holding therapeutic space. You're merging with your client's pain, absorbing her emotional content, and making the session about your empathic experience of her trauma rather than her process of healing. You can't help her heal because you're drowning in her material instead of maintaining the therapeutic container she needs." Marcus was defensive. His empathic absorption was his greatest asset as a therapist. It's what allowed him to understand clients so deeply. How could his supervisor call this a problem? His supervisor continued, "The wounded healer archetype isn't about helping from your wound. It's about helping from the integrated wisdom that emerges after you've healed your wound. You're still actively bleeding, Marcus. You're absorbing clients' trauma to avoid processing your own. And that means every session is contaminated by your unhealed material. You're not serving them. You're using them to avoid serving yourself." This is the eighth truth, and it reveals the devastating paradox. Empathic identity prevents authentic service because it creates codependent helping dynamics, boundary violations, and ego investment in outcomes rather than the clear, boundaried presence that genuine healing work requires. Jung spent significant time exploring what he called the wounded healer archetype, the recognition that healers often come to their work through their own wounding. But Jung was explicit about a crucial distinction. The wounded healer must transform their wound before they can truly serve others. The healing doesn't come from the wound itself. It comes from the integration, the transformation, the wisdom gained through doing one's own psychological work. But empaths often help from the wound, not from the transformation. They use the helping role to avoid their own healing. They absorb others' pain to flee their own. They merge with clients, friends, family members in ways that prevent genuine service while maintaining the identity as helper. Let's break down exactly why empathic identity blocks authentic service. Blockage. 1. Enmeshment prevents objectivity. True service requires the ability to be with someone's pain without becoming it, to witness their process, without merging with it, to hold space for their healing without losing yourself in their material. But empaths can't maintain this differentiation. They merge with whoever they're trying to help, absorbing their emotions, taking on their content, losing the objectivity that would allow them to see the larger patterns, the deeper dynamics, the next steps in healing. When Marcus absorbed his client's trauma, he couldn't see beyond the immediate pain. He couldn't recognize the defensive patterns she was using. He couldn't identify the ways she was avoiding deeper material. He was too merged to have perspective, and without perspective, he couldn't provide the reflections, the challenges, the confrontations that would facilitate her actual healing. Blockage 2. Projection contaminates helping. Empaths project their own unhealed material onto the people they're trying to help. They see their own wounds in others, then try to heal those projected wounds rather than addressing what's actually there. Marcus would sense abandonment trauma in clients even when their primary wounds were different, because abandonment was his unhealed material. He'd focus sessions on what he needed to heal, project it onto them, rather than on what they actually needed to address. Blockage 3. Boundary violations. We covered this earlier, but it's crucial here. Empathic helping involves constant boundary violations, reading people without permission, taking on their emotional content without consent, processing their material when they need to process it themselves, merging when they need space. Every violation is framed as caring, but it actually prevents the other person's growth because it robs them of agency in their own healing process. Blockage 4. Ego investment in outcomes. True service is offered without attachment to results. You show up, you do your work, you release the outcome, but empaths need people to heal in order to feel valuable. They need their helping to work in order to maintain their identity. Marcus couldn't tolerate clients who didn't improve because their stagnation threatened his identity as an effective healer, so he'd unconsciously manipulate sessions toward apparent progress, preventing the deeper stagnation that's often necessary for real transformation. Blockage 5. Martyr complex. Empathic helping comes with an unspoken demand. I'm suffering for you, so you owe me improvement. The helper positions themselves as sacrificing, absorbing, carrying burdens, and this creates subtle manipulation where the person being helped feels obligated to get better to justify the helper's suffering. True service has no such strings. It's offered freely, without demands, without the helper's suffering becoming the focus. Blockage 6. Avoiding own work. This is the shadow. Empaths often help others as a sophisticated form of avoiding their own healing. As long as you're focused on others' trauma, you don't have to face yours. As long as you're processing others' emotions, you can dissociate from your own. As long as you're serving, you can avoid the terrifying work of being served, of receiving, of acknowledging your own needs. Marcus spent 6 months with his supervisor, learning to recognize these patterns in his work. It was devastating. Every session revealed another way his empathic absorption was preventing authentic service. He'd merge with clients' pain instead of holding space for it. He'd absorb their trauma instead of witnessing it. He'd try to fix them instead of supporting their process. He'd need them to improve to feel valuable. He'd suffer dramatically about their suffering, making sessions about him. And all of this happened while he genuinely believed he was being deeply empathic, profoundly caring, exceptionally sensitive to their needs. The truth? He was using them. Not maliciously, but using them nonetheless, to avoid his own unhealed trauma, to maintain his identity as wounded healer, to feel important through their dependence, to stay externally focused so he never had to turn inward. Jung taught about the self as the true healer. When you're connected to your individuated self, When you've done the work of integrating shadow, withdrawing projections, becoming whole, you become a clear channel for healing presence, not because you're absorbing or processing or fixing, but because you're providing something much rarer, genuinely boundaried presence, the capacity to be fully with someone without merging, without agenda, without ego investment. This is what Jung meant by the wounded healer, someone whose wound has been transformed through their own work, who can now hold space for others' wounds, without being activated by them, without needing to fix them, without using them to avoid their own unhealed material. Let me share the distinction Jung made between empathic absorption versus authentic service. Empathic absorption, you merge with the person's pain. You take it on, process it, make it yours. You lose objectivity through enmeshment. You project your own unhealed material onto them. You violate boundaries in the name of helping. You need them to improve to feel valuable. You suffer dramatically about their suffering. You use the helping role to avoid your own work. The relationship is codependent. They become dependent on your absorption, while you become dependent on their need for you. Authentic service. You remain separate while being present. You witness their pain without taking it on. You maintain clear boundaries while offering support. You see them, not your projections. You hold space without agenda or attachment to outcome. You trust their process rather than trying to control it. Your presence is stable, not dramatic. You serve from fullness, not from wounding. The relationship supports their autonomy and growth rather than creating dependence. Marcus had to completely restructure his therapeutic practice once he understood this distinction. He had to learn to be present without merging, sit with a client's pain without absorbing it, witness their process without taking it on, maintain his center while extending compassionate attention, see them, not his projections, recognize when he was seeing his own wounds in them, distinguish their actual material from his projected content, address what was actually there, not what he needed to heal, honor their autonomy, stop processing their emotions for them, stop trying to fix or save them, trust their capacity to do their own work, offer reflection and support without taking over their process, release outcome attachment, accept that he couldn't control whether clients healed. His role was to show up and serve, period. Their improvement or stagnation wasn't about his value as a healer. Maintain boundaries, stop the energetic merging, the empathic absorption, the codependent dynamics. Create clear therapeutic container with appropriate professional boundaries. Do his own work. Use supervision to process his own material rather than using clients to avoid it. Continue his own therapy, shadow work, individuation, so he could serve from integration rather than wounding. This transformation was excruciating. For the first 6 months, Marcus felt like the worst therapist on the planet. Without empathic absorption, he didn't know how to be with clients. Without merging, he felt cold and disconnected. Without processing their emotions, he felt useless. His entire identity as gifted empath therapist collapsed. But something began emerging. Actual therapeutic presence. The capacity to be fully there without losing himself. To witness profound pain without being destroyed by it. To hold space that was genuinely safe because it had clear boundaries. To serve without needing anything in return. His clients noticed. Some left. The ones who needed a merged, codependent relationship rather than therapeutic support. But the ones who stayed began healing in ways they hadn't before, because now there was actual space for their process. Now Marcus wasn't contaminating sessions with his own material. Now they could do their work without being responsible for managing his empathic overwhelm. Jung wrote, "The doctor is effective only when he himself is affected. Only the wounded physician heals." But then Jung clarified what this meant. It is his own hurt that gives the measure of his power to heal. This, and nothing else, is the meaning of the Greek myth of the wounded physician. Wounded means transformed, not actively bleeding. The healer must be affected by their own wound, must have descended into their own darkness, faced their own shadow, done their own work, so they carry the wisdom of that journey. But they can't be currently drowning in their wound while trying to hold space for others. Marcus told me something profound 2 years into this transformation. I used to think my empathic absorption was my greatest gift as a healer. Now I realize it was my greatest limitation. It prevented me from actually serving because I was using clients to avoid serving myself. Real healing work isn't about feeling others' pain. It's about having done enough of your own work that you can hold space for theirs without contamination. The presence I can offer now is clearer, stronger, more genuinely helpful than all my empathic absorption ever was. This is what empaths need to understand. People need your presence, not your absorption. They need you to witness without merging, to be with them without taking on their material, to hold space without processing their emotions for them. They need the stability of someone who maintains their center while offering support. They need the clarity of someone who sees them, not projections. They need the trust of someone who believes in their capacity to heal themselves rather than trying to do it for them. Empathic absorption doesn't provide any of this. It creates codependence, prevents autonomy, contaminated helping with your unhealed material, violates boundaries, and makes their healing about your need to be needed. I need to share my own shift from empathic absorption to authentic service, because this transformation requires modeling. For years, I helped people by absorbing their pain, processing their emotions, taking on their burdens. I thought I was being deeply caring. I thought my empathic sensitivity was my gift to others. Then someone I'd been helping for years told me something that changed everything. Your absorption doesn't actually help me. It makes me feel like I'm too much, like my emotions are so overwhelming they're destroying you, like I need to manage your experience of my pain. What I actually need is for you to just be present without taking it on, to trust that I can handle my own emotions, to witness without drowning. That feedback devastated me because it revealed that my helping had been about me, not them, about my need to feel important through absorption, about my identity as empath, about avoiding my own emotions by processing theirs. None of it was actually serving them. It was using them while calling it service. Transforming my helping meant learning everything Marcus learned. Be present without absorbing, witness without merging, trust others' capacity instead of trying to rescue them, maintain boundaries, release outcome attachment, do my own damn work instead of using others to avoid it. And what emerged wasn't less caring, it was more effective caring, service that actually supported others' growth instead of creating dependence, presence that honored their autonomy instead of violating it, help that came from fullness instead of wounding. Here's the mirror effect for this truth. Helpers you judge for being detached or professional or boundaried often practice the differentiated service you lack. The therapist who doesn't absorb clients' trauma isn't cold. They're maintaining the therapeutic container that allows healing. The friend who can witness your pain without taking it on isn't disconnected. They're trusting your capacity to process your own emotions. The family member who sets boundaries around helping isn't selfish. They're serving from wholeness rather than codependence. Every judgment reveals your own codependent helping patterns disguised as empathic superiority. Jung understood, genuine service requires individuation first. You must become whole before you can help others become whole. You must heal your wound before you can hold space for others' wounds. You must individuate before you can support others' individuation. The empathic identity prevents this sequence. It puts helping before individuation, service before wholeness, others before self. And the result is contaminated, codependent, ego-driven helping that maintains dysfunction while claiming to heal it. So here's what transformation requires. First, stop helping from your wound. If you're still actively wounded, if you haven't done your shadow work, withdrawn your projections, faced your trauma, then your helping will contaminate others with your unhealed material. Do your work first. Heal yourself first. Transform your wound first. Second, release the identity as helper. Your worth isn't determined by how much you help, how many people need you, how effectively you absorb others' pain. Release the ego investment in being the helper, the empath, the wounded healer. Your value is intrinsic, not earned through service. Third, develop genuine boundaries. Learn to be present without merging, to witness without absorbing, to support without taking on. Clear boundaries aren't cold. They're the foundation of authentic service that honors others' autonomy. Fourth, trust others' capacity. Stop trying to fix, save, rescue. Trust that people can handle their own emotions, do their own work, heal themselves. Your role isn't to do it for them. It's to hold space while they do it. Fifth, serve from fullness. Do enough of your own individuation work that you can serve from wholeness rather than wounding, from integration rather than fragmentation, from self-connection rather than self-abandonment. Service from fullness is sustainable, clear, genuinely helpful. Sixth, release outcome attachment. You can't control whether people heal. You can't force their growth. You can't make them do their work. Your responsibility is to show up and serve. That's it. Their process is theirs. Release the need for them to improve in order for you to feel valuable. Marcus works differently now. His therapy practice is smaller. Some clients left when he stopped empathic absorption, but the clients who stay heal more deeply because he's providing what they actually need. Clear, boundaried, present witness who trusts their capacity, honors their autonomy, and serves from integrated wholeness. He told me, "I thought I'd become a colder therapist without empathic absorption. Instead, I became more effective. My presence is steadier. My perceptions are clearer. My interventions are more skillful. And clients feel safer because they're not managing my emotional experience of their trauma. They can do their own work in the space I hold. That's what healing actually requires. Not my absorption, but my presence." This is what's possible when empathic identity stops preventing authentic service. Help that actually helps. Support that honors autonomy. Presence that maintains boundaries. Service that flows from wholeness. Witness that trusts process. Not the loss of caring, the maturation of caring into something clear, boundaried, genuinely useful. Jung knew the individuated person serves most effectively, not because they merge with others, but because they've become so whole that they can offer presence without contamination, witness without absorption, support without codependence. That's the service the world actually needs. Not more empathic absorption, but more people who've done their work, integrated their shadow, become whole, and can therefore hold space for others becoming without making it about themselves. Are you ready to release empathic absorption as helping? Are you ready to do your own work so you can serve from wholeness? Are you ready to trust others' capacity instead of trying to rescue them? Because that's what authentic service requires. And the world needs that far more than it needs another empath drowning in absorption while calling it care. There's a spiritual bypass that empaths use more than any other, a way of framing their boundarylessness as connection to something greater, something cosmic, something that makes their overwhelm not a problem, but proof of spiritual advancement. They claim to be connected to the collective unconscious, to universal consciousness, to the field of all human emotion. And this claim sounds profound, spiritual, evolved, until you understand what Jung actually meant by the collective unconscious. Let me introduce you to Elena, 42 years old, spiritual teacher, empath, who described her experience as feeling the collective pain of humanity, sensing the global unconscious, being a conduit for universal emotional energy. She positioned her empathic overwhelm as evidence of profound spiritual connection. She wasn't just sensitive to individuals, but to the entire collective consciousness of the human species. She taught workshops on navigating collective emotional downloads, on processing ancestral trauma, on holding space for the planetary shift in consciousness. Her students revered her. She seemed to operate on a level of awareness they aspired to reach. She was drowning in what she experienced as collective emotional content, and she wore that drowning as a crown of spiritual mastery. Then she attended a Jung conference and heard a Jungian analyst describe the collective unconscious, and she realized with horror what she'd been calling connection to collective consciousness was actually unprocessed material from the collective unconscious, flooding her psyche because she had no ego strength, no boundaries, no filters. She wasn't spiritually advanced, she was psychologically flooded. This is the ninth truth, and it addresses the spiritual bypass empaths use most frequently. Claiming connection to collective consciousness while lacking individual boundaries isn't spiritual advancement, it's the collective unconscious, flooding an undeveloped ego structure that has no capacity to mediate the overwhelming archetypal and collective content. Jung spent decades exploring what he called the collective unconscious, that layer of the psyche beneath the personal unconscious, containing inherited patterns, universal archetypes, and the accumulated experiences of humanity. But Jung was explicit about something crucial. Healthy relationship with the collective unconscious requires a strong, individuated ego as mediator. Without a developed ego, without clear boundaries, stable sense of self, individuated consciousness, the collective unconscious doesn't enlighten you. It floods you, it overwhelms you, it destroys you, and what you experience isn't profound spiritual connection. It's psychological inundation with content you have no capacity to process. Let's understand the distinction Jung made between authentic collective consciousness connection versus empathic flooding. Authentic connection. You've completed enough individuation work to develop a strong ego. This ego serves as mediator between consciousness and the unconscious, both personal and collective. You can access collective unconscious material consciously, deliberately, with discernment. You engage with archetypes through active imagination, dreams, creative work. You recognize when you're encountering collective patterns versus personal material. You have filters that screen what enters consciousness. You maintain your center while exploring collective depths. The connection enriches your understanding without destroying your functioning. Empathic flooding. You have weak or non-existent ego boundaries. The collective unconscious isn't accessed consciously. It floods you involuntarily. You can't distinguish between your personal, emotional content, others' projected material, and archetypal patterns from the collective. Everything enters your consciousness with equal intensity. You have no filters, no mediation, no capacity to process what's flooding in. You lose your center, your functioning, your stability. What you experience as collective emotional downloads is actually boundary-less flooding that's destroying you while you frame it as spiritual gifting. Jung wrote, "The collective unconscious contains the whole spiritual heritage of mankind's evolution born anew in the brain structure of every individual." This is profound. We each contain the accumulated wisdom, patterns, and experiences of human history in our psychic structure, but Jung also warned, accessing this heritage requires preparation. Unprepared access, ego flooding by collective unconscious material, is psychological disaster, not spiritual enlightenment. Elena had been experiencing empathic overwhelm her entire adult life. In crowded places, she'd feel what she described as waves of collective emotion washing over her. In quiet meditation, she'd experience what she called ancestral trauma releasing through her system. In her daily life, she'd be flooded by what she interpreted as the planetary pain body, the global shadow, the universal grief of humanity. She genuinely believed she was a highly sensitive soul, doing important spiritual work, processing collective content that less aware people couldn't access. Her overwhelm was evidence of her spiritual service. Her inability to function normally proved how attuned she was to universal consciousness. Then the Jungian analyst at the conference explained what was actually happening. Elena had no ego boundaries. The collective unconscious was flooding her psyche because there was no structure to mediate it. She was experiencing archetypal content, collective patterns, cultural complexes, but without the ego strength to recognize them as collective material rather than her own experience. Let's break down how empaths misinterpret collective unconscious material. Misinterpretation. Archetypal content experienced as personal emotion. The collective unconscious contains archetypes, universal patterns like the mother, the hero, the shadow, the anima, animus. These archetypes carry enormous emotional charge. When they activate in your psyche, they bring intense feeling. But without ego boundaries, you experience archetypal emotion as if it's your personal feeling or something you're absorbing from your environment. You might feel crushing maternal grief, but it's not yours or anyone's specifics. It's the archetypal mother activating. You can't distinguish because you lack the ego structure to recognize archetypal versus personal material. Misinterpretation 2. Collective trauma experienced as current overwhelm. The collective unconscious holds humanity's accumulated trauma, war, genocide, oppression, violence across generations. This content exists in the psyche of every human. With proper boundaries, you can access this material consciously, learn from it, integrate what's relevant. Without boundaries, it floods you as overwhelming emotion. You experience as current, immediate, personal. You feel ancient grief, collective rage, ancestral terror, but you interpret it as absorbing current emotional energy from your environment. Misinterpretation 3. Cultural complexes, experienced as individual states. Jung's students developed the concept of cultural complexes, unconscious patterns shared by groups, nations, cultures. These complexes contain the unprocessed shadow of collective groups. Americans share certain complexes around individualism, success, denial. Europeans carry different collective patterns. Every culture has shadow material in the collective unconscious. Without boundaries, you absorb these cultural complexes and experience them as individual emotional states you're picking up from people around you. Misinterpretation per se. Psychic epidemics experienced as personal sensitivity. Jung wrote about psychic epidemics, mass psychological contagion, where unconscious material spreads through collectives. Fear epidemics, rage epidemics, mass delusion. These operate through the collective unconscious, affecting large groups simultaneously. With boundaries, you can observe these epidemics without being consumed. Without boundaries, you're swept up in the psychic contagion, experiencing it as your personal empathic overwhelm rather than recognizing it as collective phenomenon you're caught in. Elena started working with a Jungian analyst to understand what was actually flooding her. Session by session, they traced her empathic episodes back to their actual sources. The collective grief she felt in meditation. Archetypal material from the Great Mother, the grief every mother has felt across human history at the loss of children. Ancient, powerful, universal, but not hers. not from her environment. Archetypal content flooding a psyche with no boundaries to mediate it. The ancestral trauma she experienced releasing through her. Collective unconscious material related to cultural complexes from her ethnic heritage. Generations of oppression, displacement, violence. Real trauma, but not hers personally. Collective content she was flooded with because she couldn't distinguish between personal and collective material. The planetary pain she absorbed in crowds. Psychic epidemic, collective anxiety, rage, fear circulating through the unconscious of her culture. Mass psychological contagion that felt personal because she had no filters to recognize it as collective phenomenon. None of it was empathic absorption from individuals around her. All of it was collective unconscious material flooding an undeveloped ego that couldn't mediate the overwhelming archetypal and collective content. Jung created a framework for collective unconscious integration that empaths need to understand. Step 1. Develop ego strength. Before you can consciously access collective unconscious material, you need a strong ego, stable sense of self, clear boundaries, capacity for self-reflection. This ego serves as the mediator that can encounter overwhelming content without being destroyed. Empaths skip this step, trying to access collective material before developing the ego structure to handle it. Step 2. Learn symbol and archetype language. The collective unconscious speaks in symbols, images, archetypes. You need to develop literacy in this language. When archetypal material arises, you need to recognize it as archetypal rather than personal. This requires study, depth work, learning to distinguish between I'm sad, personal, and I'm experiencing the archetype of grief, collective. Step 3. Establish psychic filters. Not all collective unconscious material is relevant to your personal development. You need filters that screen what enters consciousness, what patterns are important for you to engage, what collective material is just noise, what archetypal content serves your individuation. Without filters, everything floods in with equal intensity, creating overwhelm rather than insight. Step 4. Practice conscious engagement versus unconscious flooding. The difference between authentic collective unconscious work and empathic flooding is consciousness. Authentic work involves deliberately, consciously, choosing to engage collective material through active imagination, dream work, creative expression. Flooding is involuntary, unconscious, overwhelming. You're not choosing to engage. You're being inundated without capacity to process. Elena spent 3 years developing these capacities, building ego strength through individuation work, learning to recognize archetypal patterns, establishing boundaries that filtered collective material, practicing conscious engagement with the collective unconscious rather than being involuntarily flooded. The transformation was profound. She still had access to collective unconscious material, but now consciously, deliberately, with discernment. She could recognize when she was encountering archetypal content versus personal emotion. She could engage with cultural complexes without being destroyed by them. She could observe psychic epidemics without being swept up in mass contagion. What she'd called collective consciousness connection had actually been boundary-less flooding. What she'd claimed as spiritual advancement was psychological inundation, and developing the ego strength to actually work with collective unconscious material required admitting she'd been drowning, not enlightened. I need to share my own misinterpretation of collective unconscious flooding because this bypass is seductive. For years, I believed I was connected to something profound, sensing humanity's pain, feeling collective trauma, accessing universal emotional fields. It felt meaningful, spiritual, important. It made my empathic overwhelm seem like sacred service rather than dysfunction. Then I studied Jung seriously and realized I wasn't accessing the collective unconscious consciously. It was flooding me because I had no boundaries. The overwhelming emotions I experienced weren't profound spiritual downloads. They were archetypal and collective material, overwhelming an undeveloped ego that couldn't mediate it. The universal grief I felt, the death-rebirth archetype activating without me recognizing it as archetypal. The collective rage I sensed, cultural complex from my society's shadow, flooding my boundaryless psyche. The planetary shift I was supposedly feeling, psychic epidemic I was caught in because I had no filters to observe it from outside. Developing ego strength and boundaries didn't disconnect me from the collective unconscious. It gave me conscious access for the first time. Now I could engage archetypal material deliberately through dream work and active imagination. I could recognize collective patterns without being destroyed by them. I could observe psychic epidemics without drowning in mass contagion. The spiritual bypass of claiming collective consciousness connection while lacking boundaries, that had to die. And with its death came actual relationship with the collective unconscious as Jung intended it. Conscious, mediated, enriching rather than destroying. Here's the mirror effect for this truth. People you judge for being disconnected from collective consciousness often have the healthy ego boundaries you lack. They're not less spiritually evolved, they're more psychologically developed. They can function in the world because they're not being flooded by unmediated collective unconscious material. They have the ego strength that allows conscious engagement rather than unconscious flooding. The person who isn't overwhelmed by collective pain. They have boundaries that distinguish personal from collective material. The person who can be in crowds without drowning. They have filters that screen collective content. The person who seems unaware of planetary shifts. They're not caught in the psychic epidemic you're drowning in. Every judgment reveals your own lack of ego development disguised as spiritual superiority. Jung warned about what happens when people try to access collective unconscious material without proper preparation. It is indeed no small matter to know of one's subjection to any of the collective archetypes. It is practically like an operation, and naturally, nothing is cut away, but something irrevocably given up. What must be given up is the inflation, the belief that your boundary-less flooding is spiritual advancement, the claim that your overwhelm is connection to something greater, the identity built on being cosmically sensitive rather than psychologically undeveloped. Elena had to give up her identity as someone who processed collective consciousness for the planet. That identity had made her feel important, special, spiritually advanced. Recognizing it was actually ego flooding by material she couldn't mediate. That truth destroyed her self-concept. But through that destruction came actual development, the capacity to engage collective unconscious material consciously. The wisdom that comes from working with archetypes deliberately, the understanding that emerges from observing cultural complexes without being consumed by them, the stability that develops from having ego boundaries strong enough to mediate overwhelming content. She told me, "I thought I was spiritually evolved because I felt everything. I was actually psychologically flooded because I had no boundaries. Real spiritual work isn't about being overwhelmed by collective consciousness. It's about developing the ego strength to engage it consciously. That requires humility I didn't have when I thought my flooding was enlightenment. So here's what empaths need to understand about the collective unconscious. It's real. Jung was right. There is a layer of psyche containing universal patterns, archetypal structures, collective human experience. But accessing it requires preparation. You need ego strength, boundaries, filters, conscious engagement capacity. Without these, you don't access it. It floods you. Flooding isn't connection. Being overwhelmed by collective unconscious material isn't spiritual advancement. It's psychological inundation that needs healing, not celebration. Genuine work requires individuation first. You must become a separate, stable individual before you can consciously engage collective material. The sequence matters. Individuation, then collective unconscious work, not collective flooding as substitute for individuation. Boundaries don't prevent connection. Proper ego boundaries allow authentic relationship with collective unconscious. Boundarylessness creates flooding, not connection. Jung's vision for humanity wasn't more people flooded by collective unconscious material. It was more people individuated enough to consciously engage that material, integrate what's relevant, and contribute to collective consciousness evolution through their own development. That's the path forward, not claiming spiritual connection while drowning in flooding, but developing the ego's strength that allows genuine conscious engagement with collective depths. Are you ready to release the spiritual bypass? Are you ready to build the boundaries that make real collective unconscious work possible? Are you ready to admit that what you've been calling enlightenment might be flooding? Because that admission is the beginning of actual development, not inflated claims of cosmic connection, but humble recognition that you need to build the psychological structures that would make such connection conscious, mediated, enriching rather than destroying. The collective unconscious is waiting, but it requires an individuated ego to meet it. Are you willing to do that work?